Richard Chase was an American serial killer, cannibal and necrophiliac who killed 6 people in the space of a single month between December 1977 and January 1978 in California, leading to him being dubbed the Vampire of Sacramento. He was a dangerously disturbed young man whose crimes were especially heinous as he murdered a pregnant woman and small children while committing horrific acts of mutilation to the bodies of those he killed. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Richard Trenton Chase was born on May 23, 1950, in Sacramento, the capital of California. He was only alive for 30 years, but his entire life seems to have been characterized by violence, either perpetrated by him or against him. It's reported that Chase's parents, Beatrice and Richard Sr., were strict disciplinarians who doled out punishment regularly for the smallest infractions. It's reported that when Chase was only 2 years old, his father force-fed him until he vomited. Pamela, Chase's sister, would recall regular confrontations between father and son, where Richard Sr. would shake his son or throw him against a wall. Richard Sr. would also emotionally abuse those in the household, including demeaning his son. Due to Richard Sr.'s difficulty in managing money and his alcoholism, he and Beatrice would frequently fight in front of the children. Beatrice seemed to show signs of mental illness, with her accusing her husband of poisoning her. By the age of 10 years old, Chase was exhibiting signs of bedwetting, pyromania, and cruelty to animals, which are the 3 corners of what is known as the McDonald Triad, a theory proposed by psychiatrist J.M. MacDonald in 1963, which states that the presence of any 2 of these traits is an accurate predictor of serious violence, including homicide and serial homicide, in adulthood, although this theory has been criticized for its oversimplification. With regards to the last of these traits, cruelty to animals, as a child, Chase began cutting open dead birds that he found, but would then begin targeting neighborhood cats, torturing them, killing them, and then dissecting them. It got to the point where cats were disappearing in the neighborhood on an almost daily basis. Chase's morbid fascination with death seems to have been an escape to the hardships at home, and I think that his torturing and killing animals gave him a sense of power and control at a time when he felt utterly powerless. Chase began to demonstrate signs of serious mental illness, and at the age of 13 had a psychotic episode where he became convinced that he was part of the James Younger Gang, the gang of outlaws from the 19th century, which included the infamous Jesse James. It appears that his parents were too busy fighting each other to see their son slipping further and further into delusion, and even at this young age, Chase's grip on reality was almost non-existent. Chase was popular at school and seemed to thrive here and dated several girls. However, due to psychological issues, he was impotent, and when he was unable to perform, girls would leave him, leaving him feeling angry and humiliated. This appears to have further pushed Chase into fantasy and delusion, and continued to turn in on himself into a world of mental illness and an increasing fixation on death. Richard Chase's delusions, as with other people with mental illness, appear to have been rooted in his underlying insecurities and concerns with his inability to gain an erection, devolving into a bizarre belief that he did not have enough blood in his body and that he needed to consume the blood of animals in order to survive. And this is what he did, with him beginning to drink the blood of the animals that he killed and tortured. Chase was also a hypochondriac, and this again appeared to reach a level of bizarre belief, with him believing that his heart would occasionally stop beating and that someone had stolen his pulmonary artery. Chase also believed that he had insufficient vitamin C in his body, and so would hold oranges to his head, believing he could absorb the vitamins through his skin. Another belief that Chase had was that the bones in his skull were moving around, so he shaved his head so he could see this apparent phenomenon. As a teenager, Chase would experiment with alcohol and drugs, particularly LSD and cannabis, and of course, the inclusion of substances just seemed to make his delusions more frequent, bizarre, and vivid. In his late teens or early 20s, Chase moved out of his mother's home and moved into a house share, but began to exhibit bizarre behavior as soon as he arrived. He boarded up his bedroom door and, when he did come out, often drunk and in a haze of cannabis smoke, he would walk around stark naked. Chase's housemates demanded he moved out. When he refused, all of them moved out instead, leaving him in the property alone. Here, he would continue to kill animals and would use a blender to turn their organs into liquid, which he would then drink, sometimes mixed with Coca-Cola, with him believing that this would stop his heart from shrinking, another fear of his. Richard Chase eventually ended up in psychiatric care in 1973, when he was aged 23, but was only held for a short time before being released again. In 1976, aged 26, the year before his murder spree, Chase was again in psychiatric care, having been admitted to hospital after poisoning himself when he injected animal blood directly into his veins. Whilst in the psychiatric ward, Chase would capture, kill, and drink the blood of birds that he caught out of the window. He was diagnosed as having paranoid schizophrenia, a serious mental health condition where the sufferer experiences delusions and paranoia. Chase was given antipsychotics and appeared to recover, and was released just a few months later into the care of his mother, having been assessed as no longer posing a risk to society or himself. The critical mistake is that when living with his mother, she weaned him off his medication. Why is unclear. Potentially the stigma around mental illness and relying on medication was more prevalent in the 1970s, or perhaps she genuinely thought she was helping him. However, whatever the reasons, this was a critical mistake, as paranoid schizophrenia is a lifelong condition that can't be willed away and needs to be managed carefully for the rest of the sufferer's life. Then, as if to compound the situation, Chase moved into another property, and again his housemates moved out, leaving Chase alone, with no one seeing his descent into madness. In mid-1977, Chase was arrested on an Indian reservation covered in blood in the Lake Tahoe area. His clothes were soaked in blood, and in his truck he had a bucket of blood and guns. The blood was found to have come from a cow, and due to this, no charges were filed. By this point, Chase's personal hygiene had deteriorated, as he had no interest in caring for himself. He did not bathe or clean his teeth. He was a mess of long, straggly hair, and his weight had dropped significantly. One day in 1977, Chase rang his mother's doorbell and greeted her by thrusting a dead cat in her face. He then threw the cat to the ground, knelt down, ripped its stomach open with his bare hands, and stuck his hands inside the cat, smearing its blood all over his face while screaming. His mother calmly returned inside the house and did not report the incident to anyone. Chase began to develop an obsession with guns and would purchase several of these and practice with them obsessively. By December 1977, Chase's grip on reality had completely disappeared, and his focus shifted from mutilating and killing animals to human beings, and he began a rampage of murder which lasted for the next 4 weeks, claiming the lives of 6 people. On December the 29th, 1977, Richard Chase killed his first victim in the drive-by shooting. The victim, Ambrose Griffin, was a 51-year-old engineer and father of 3 who was out on an evening walk with his wife in the Sacramento area. A car then drove past and 2 shots rang out. One of these hit Ambrose in the chest, killing him. There was no known link between Chase and Ambrose. This was apparently a random act of violence, a warm-up for the murders to come. The bullet was determined to have come from a .22 handgun, and the bullet was linked to an incident only 2 days before where someone had fired into the property of a woman, although no one was hurt. Again, this was clearly another warm-up by Chase for the horror that was to come. Chase then began hunting for a victim, walking the streets of Sacramento, trying doors to see if they were unlocked. After his arrest, during an interview, Chase stated he took an unlocked door as akin to an invite inside, but quote, "If the door was locked, that means you're not welcome." This led to at least one chilling encounter when, on the 23rd of January 1978, a woman called Jean Layton was in her home when she spotted a disheveled man approaching her door. He tried her patio door and found it locked, and also went to the windows, which were also locked. He then circled the house and returned to the patio door, all the time while Jean was watching. Their eyes met, and Jean came face to face with Richard Chase, who simply stared at her, lit a cigarette, and walked away. I've no doubt if she'd opened the door, Even to ask if he was lost, Chase would have brutally murdered her, given what he did that same evening. Down the street, a short time later, Robert and Barbara Edwards were bringing their groceries into the house when they heard a noise inside. Whoever was in there apparently heard them and started to run, and they heard a window slam at the back of the house. They then saw Richard Chase walking towards them. Robert tried to stop this man, but he broke free and ran off. The police were called, and it was clear the man had been trying to steal valuables, but he'd also urinated in a drawer of baby's clothing and defecated on the baby's bed. Chase continued prowling the area until he reached 2360 Tioga Way, the home of newlyweds David and Teresa Wallin. Teresa Wallin was a 22-year-old newlywed who'd recently moved into her new home on Tioga Way. She took pride in her property and everything was neat and tidy. Teresa was, in January 1978, 3 months pregnant, expecting her first child with her husband David. On January the 23rd, 1978, Teresa was preparing to take out the garbage, and whilst holding the bag, she unlocked the door, and Chase rushed in, taking her by surprise. He then raised his gun, and instinctively Teresa lifted her hands up to try and defend herself. The first shot entered her palm, travelling up her arm and exiting out of her elbow. The second shot entered Teresa's head, and she instantly fell to the floor. Chase then stood over Teresa and fired a third shot into her temple, killing her. Chase then dragged Teresa's body into the bedroom, leaving a bloody trail behind him. He then retrieved a knife and an empty yogurt pot from the rubbish. Chase then had sex with her body, stabbing her repeatedly whilst he was doing this. When he was finished, he began to mutilate her body. Chase cut open Teresa's body below her sternum and pulled out her spleen and intestines. He stabbed her repeatedly in her lungs, liver, diaphragm, and left breast. He cut out her kidneys, but then placed them back inside her body. The yogurt pot was found discarded close by, covered in blood, and lip marks showed it had been used to hold Teresa's blood, which Chase had drunk. Blood rings were found on the floor, and these were from a bucket which Chase had used to collect more of Teresa's blood. He'd then gone into the bathroom in order to bathe himself in it. As a final act of degradation, Chase had collected dog feces from the Wallins' front yard and put this in Teresa's mouth. He then left. David, her husband, returned a short time later to find his wife, an unborn child dead, and her body horrifically mutilated. I've seen a picture of her body and it's absolutely horrific. I can't imagine what David must have felt when he came across this scene and whether the picture of his wife's body has ever left his mind. In the days after murdering Teresa, it's reported that Chase bought 2 puppies, killed them, drank their blood, and dumped their bodies on neighbours' front yards. On January the 27th, 1978, Richard Chase committed his final murders, which qualifies as a mass killing as he killed 4 people in one location. Finding the front door unlocked, Chase entered the home address of 38-year-old Evelyn Moroff, who was babysitting her 22-month-old nephew David. Also present in the home was Evelyn's 6-year-old son Jason and Dan Meredith, a neighbour who'd come over to check on Evelyn. Evelyn was in the bath whilst Dan watched the children. Hearing someone enter the house, Dan went to investigate and came across Chase in the hallway. Without saying a word, Chase pulled out his gun and shot Dan in the head, killing him instantly. Chase then took Dan's wallet and car keys from his body. Chase then shot 22-month-old David in the head and, as he ran to find his mother, shot 6-year-old Jason twice in the head, killing him. Chase then went to Evelyn's room and shot her in the head, killing her. He then had anal sex with her corpse and sliced the back of her neck so he could drink her blood. Chase stabbed Evelyn in the anus at least 6 times with a knife and then cut her stomach open, collecting her blood in a bucket which he then drank. Chase then took the corpse of 22-month-old David, split his head open, and apparently consumed some of his brains. A knock at the front door disturbed Chase, and he fled, taking the body of David with him, fleeing in Dan's vehicle. Police were called due to a neighbour's child noticing a strange man in Evelyn's property, and the description given matched a man who'd been seen loitering around the area trying doors. The police started a search immediately, hoping that baby David was still, by some miracle, alive, not realizing that he was already dead. Dan's vehicle was found abandoned. Police didn't know it at the time, but it was left only 150 yards from Chase's home address. The FBI were already developing a profile of the perpetrator of these crimes, which were easily linked as Richard Chase had made no effort to cover his tracks, leaving footprints and handprints all over the scenes of his crimes. The offences were also linked by the bullets recovered, which showed they'd been fired from the same gun. The profile indicated the killer was disorganised as opposed to organised, i.e. a lack of planning, opportunistic offending, and little attempt to remove forensic traces. The profile also speculated that the offender was in his 20s, likely a dishevelled man who lived alone, who had a history of mental illness. However, it was a call from a member of the public which led police to Chase's door. Specifically, a woman called Nancy Holden, during the time of Chase's offences, had been approached by a dishevelled, long-haired man who she tried to avoid but couldn't. He then asked her a question about a person called Kurt, who was someone she had dated, but who was killed in a motorcycle accident. There was a spark of familiarity, and she asked his name, to which he said, Rick Chase. Nancy then realised she was talking to someone she went to school with, but he had changed dramatically. He appeared unwell both physically and mentally. Later, when Nancy saw a police photo fit of the man they were looking for the murders, she knew it was Chase and called the police. A check of Richard Chase showed not only his history of mental illness, but that he was also the owner of a .22 handgun. The police were sure that they had their man. Soon after this phone call, police descended on the apartment of Richard Chase and banged on the front door. Despite knowing he was in there, he would not answer. The detective decided to trick Chase. They pretended to leave and then arrested him when he emerged carrying a blood-stained box. It transpired later that this box had been used to hold David's remains. The police searched Chase and found the murder weapon, the .22 handgun, as well as Dan Meredith's wallet and latex gloves. Chase was taken in for questioning, and whilst admitting to killing animals, he refused to admit his guilt for the other offences. The police, working on the hope that baby David was still alive, entered his apartment and stepped into a nightmare. The putrid smell was overwhelming, and every surface of the property was covered in blood, including on drinking glasses. In the kitchen, they found several small pieces of bone and some dishes in the refrigerator with body parts. An electric blender was badly stained and smelt of rot. It would be discovered later that the blender was used to liquefy David's organs, creating a liquid that Chase then drank. There were also 3 pet collars, but no animals to be found. Detectives found newspapers on which ads selling dogs were circled. In a Tupperware box, they found part of the brain of baby David. They also recovered some of Evelyn Maroth and Teresa Wallin's internal organs. In 1979, Chase stood trial for 6 counts of murder. I want to play some clips from his appearances in court. They're not particularly informative, but I think it's interesting to see what Chase looked like, how he moved, etc. In order to avoid the death penalty, the defence tried to have Chase found guilty of second-degree murder, which would result in a life sentence. Their case hinged on Chase's history of mental illness and the lack of planning in his crimes, evidence they were not premeditated. However, on the 8th of May 1979, Richard Chase was found guilty of the first-degree murders of Ambrose Griffin, Therese Wallin, Evelyn Maroth, 22-month David, 6-year-old Jason, and Dan Meredith. The defence asked for clemency, but the judge determined that Richard Chase was not legally insane and he was sentenced to death, with this method of execution being the gas chamber. Chase was sent to death row in San Quentin prison to await his execution. However, he would never be executed. On December the 26th, 1980, Richard Chase was found dead in his cell, having committed suicide. He had overdosed on his prescription medication, which he had been storing for weeks. This is one of the most horrific cases I've covered, and is so difficult to understand because, as with other people who commit crimes with an underlying serious mental health issue, their motives make sense only to themselves, whilst us outside observers find only complete chaos in their thinking. This is the difficulty in the case of Richard Chase. It's clear that he was extremely mentally unwell and was fixated on blood, with him believing that consuming this bodily fluid would somehow keep him alive. I think that Richard Chase assigned his poor physical health not to self-neglect, but to the fact that he was not consuming enough blood, or potentially the right type of blood. This may be why he switched from drinking animal blood to human blood. Consuming body parts would potentially have also led him to believe that he could cure his ailments, or potentially thought he could absorb power from his victims. However, this explanation does not explain certain aspects of his offending, specifically necrophilia and defiling the bodies of at least one of his victims, also urinating and defecating in another property. There's something about destroying and defiling people and property. Chase had delusions of persecution, including that the government and aliens were after him, so maybe some of his acts were his way of fighting back against a society that he felt was out to get him. We will never know, as any explanation that could have been provided by Richard Chase died with him at the age of 30 when he escaped his date with the executioner. However, by any measure, Richard Chase was an extremely dangerous man, not just because of the savagery of his behaviour, but also the indiscriminate and unpredictable nature of his offences. He would literally kill men, women and children, any place, at any time. Mark Hobson was born on the 2nd of September 1969 in Wakefield, West Yorkshire in the UK. Hobson's childhood was described by friends as, quote, happy and stable, and he grew up with his parents Peter and Sandra and his two sisters Melanie and Leslie. The family eventually moved to Selby, North Yorkshire. However, despite apparently there being no issues in his childhood, Hobson soon began displaying extreme violence towards others, including in 1990 when he viciously attacked a girlfriend. In 1991, Hobson moved in with his childhood sweetheart Kay and her two children. The pair had a daughter together and married in 1993. Hobson worked at various jobs, including a landscape gardener and as a nightclub doorman in 1998. Hobson then, without any warning, informed Kay that he was leaving the marriage, and, on the 1st of January 1999, he simply walked out of the family home. Kay later said, quote, there was no one else involved. He just didn't want married life anymore. It was bizarre. I couldn't believe it. He turned to pot and drinking heavily. He never drank when we were married, but now he got off his face. He became like a zombie. His life just went completely off the rails. Hobson's life indeed went off the rails, and he spent the next few years floating around, and his alcohol use and use of drugs, particularly cannabis, increased. Hobson was apparently soon drinking approximately 35 cans of strong beer a day. In March 2002, a man called William Brace was walking through Selby town centre when, across the road, he spotted his ex-girlfriend with Hobson. William was not too happy about this, his ex-girlfriend and his friend now going out, and so he went across the road to confront them. As he approached, William felt a pain in his stomach and believed that Hobson had punched him. However, when he noticed the blood, he realised he'd been stabbed, In quick succession, Hobson stabbed William a further 5 times in broad daylight in front of shocked passers-by. He used a box cutter that he'd taken from his place of work in a factory. William lay bleeding in the street, and Hobson was apparently enjoying watching him bleed to death. Despite significant blood loss and a punctured lung, William survived. Hobson was arrested and ended up in court, where he admitted to wounding with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. In the UK, this is a serious offence, one step down from attempted murder. So you had an unprovoked attack with multiple stab wounds in broad daylight in front of numerous witnesses, and Hobson's punishment was, brace yourself, a 2-year probation order and 100 hours of community service. Mark Hobson should have received a significant custodial sentence for this incident, and had he would have been safely behind bars, and none of the horror that was about to take place would have happened. Claire Sanderson was aged 26 when she met Hobson, when they worked together at the same packaging plant in Selby in 2003. She had a twin sister called Diane. Claire and Hobson shared a mutual love of Tracy Chapman records and drinking, and they quickly became a couple, with people stating that Claire was, quote, smitten with Hobson. By April 2003, Claire had convinced her parents to lend her money for a deposit for a flat, and her and Hobson moved in together. However, Hobson began to demonstrate extreme violence towards Claire almost immediately, and he didn't care who saw what he was doing. On one occasion, a local man dragged Hobson off Claire when he was physically stood on her whilst holding a 12-inch butcher's knife to her neck. On another occasion, Hobson was seen punching Claire repeatedly in the face whilst holding her around the neck. Over the next year, Claire was the victim of repeated acts of violence, which resulted in the police being called on repeated occasions, but she appeared to be unable to give up on Hobson, with people stating that she, quote, followed him around like a lapdog. By the beginning of July 2004, Hobson was telling friends that he, quote, chose the wrong sister, and that he was going to, quote, have Claire's twin sister Diane. On Sunday, the 11th of July 2004, Hobson put his plan to remove Claire and pursue Diane into action. In the evening of this day, Claire and Hobson spent time drinking in a pub before going back to their flat. When they returned, Hobson attacked Claire, hitting her 17 times in the head with a hammer, killing her. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and hid it in their bedroom. Claire's family noticed her absence quickly, and Hobson began stalling for time, telling them that Claire was sick or out visiting friends, but they were clearly becoming concerned. Little did they know that Hobson was planning his next murder and was reading survival manuals, anticipating that, when he was finished, he would need to go on the run. On the 17th of July 2004, 6 days after killing Claire, Hobson called her twin sister Diane and told her that Claire had glandular fever and was too ill to talk, but wanted her to visit. Diane left the home she shared with her mother and father and eagerly turned up. At 7:30 p.m, she stepped over the threshold into the flat, not knowing that her sister's body was wrapped in bin bags just up the stairs. Hobson then attacked her and, after hog-tying her, tortured her with scissors and razor blades to cut and stab her, including mutilating her genitals. She was also sexually assaulted, and he bit off her left nipple, which is believed that he swallowed. Hobson placed a bag over Diane's head and repeatedly beat her with a hammer. Eventually, Hobson strangled Diane to death. He then wrapped her body in bin bags and lay it next to that of her sister, whose body by now was starting to decompose. Diane's death was noticed almost immediately, as, after visiting her sister, she was meant to be going to meet her boyfriend at the pub. At approximately 8:45 p.m, the boyfriend, Ian Harrison, called Diane's mobile to find out where she was. Hobson answered the phone and made up a story that Claire and Diane's father, George Sanderson, had had a heart attack, so they had both rushed to be by his bedside. Ian was actually an old friend of Hobson's, so the pair arranged to meet at the pub instead. Hobson turned up, and he's described as being calm and showing absolutely no sign that he just viciously murdered Ian's girlfriend and now had 2 bodies in his bedroom. Remarkably, Hobson actually invited Ian to come back to the property. Why is unclear. Potentially he was intending to murder him, although he didn't eventually do this. When Ian turned up, he noticed an odd smell, which was the smell of Claire's decomposing body, which Hobson said was the drains, and he spotted blood on the sofa, which Hobson said was due to Claire's, quote, woman's problems. Hobson even invited Ian to stay the night, which he refused. When Ian used the toilet, Hobson stood behind him, and it was only later that Ian realised why, as this was to stop him from going into the bedroom, the room opposite, where the 2 bodies were lying on the floor. Ian went home, and by 7 a.m. the next morning, the 18th of July, he had still not heard from Diane and was beginning to worry. He went round to Diane's house, and when her father George opened the door in perfect health, he knew something was wrong. Ian and George went to Hobson's flat and forced entry. There, they found the mutilated and abused bodies of both women, but no sign of Hobson, who, by this point, had fled. The police were called, and they found evidence almost straight away which showed that the murders were premeditated, with them recovering a, quote, to-do list in the property. On it was a shopping list of items, including bin bags, duct tape, cable ties, fly spray, and air freshener, as well as a plan to lure Diane to the property, with, quote, use and abuse at will, being written by her name. Also written was a list of targets, including Diane and Claire's parents, as well as his ex-wife Kay. It was obvious who committed the murders, and the police began looking for Hobson, but unfortunately, by this point, he had already murdered 2 more people. After Ian had left the flat in the late evening of the 17th of July 2004, Hobson called his mother and claimed that, rather than being dead and their bodies wrapped up in the bedroom, Diane and Claire had been in a road traffic accident and had been badly injured and taken to hospital. Hobson asked for a lift to the hospital, which was in York. Hobson's mother picked him up and drove him the 15 miles to the hospital, arriving at around 2 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004. She then sat in the car park and Hobson went in. He returned a short time later and told his mother that the sisters were receiving treatment and that he was going to stay. Hobson's mother then drove off and assumed that her son would make his own way back later. Why Hobson went through this pantomime is unclear. I assume it was to get out of the area without alerting his mother, but why did he want to go to this area specifically? We will never know. We also don't know what he did for the next few hours, but what we do know is that he travelled on foot to a small village called Strensall, which is about 6 miles away from the hospital. Living there were James Britton, aged 80, and his wife Joan, aged 81, a couple who'd been married for over 50 years and were enjoying their twilight years together. James had a condition similar to Parkinson's disease and was deaf and walked with a stick. Joan is described as being even more frail, and she too walked with a stick. At 8:55 a.m. on the 18th of July 2004, neighbours of the Brittons popped in to check on them and then left. Sometime between 9 a.m. and 11 a.m, Hobson broke into the property and attacked both James and Joan, beating them both with their own walking sticks. He then stabbed both of them. In the case of Joan, Hobson knocked her to the ground and stabbed her with such force that the blade went through her body and stuck in the floor underneath her. The blade then snapped off, so she was found in this state, the blade of the knife still in her body, when at 11:15 a.m, a neighbour again came to check on the couple and found a scene of absolute horror. The home had been ransacked, apparently due to Hobson looking for money. Hobson had made no real attempts to cover his tracks, and his fingerprints were found all over the property, including in the couple's blood. Police quickly attended and connected both crime scenes, and Mark Hobson became Britain's most wanted man. Police quickly began running through the list of places that Hobson could have gone to ground, including his friends and family. What they didn't know was that Hobson was hiding out in some fields, approximately 5 miles outside of the outskirts of York, in a village called Shipton by Benningborough, apparently using the survival skills that he'd learned from various books he'd read. However, he was clearly no Bear Grylls, as Hobson soon ran out of water, and a week after the murders of James and Joan Britton, on the 25th of July 2004, Hobson walked into a petrol station to buy matches, cigarette papers, and a bottle of water. He was instantly recognised by staff at the petrol station, and the police were called. Armed police swarmed the area, and within minutes, Hobson was arrested. As he was led away, Hobson said to the police, quote, "I'm a fucking murderer, aren't I?" Mark Hobson admitted all 4 killings at court, and, on the 25th of May 2005, appeared for sentencing at Leeds Crown Court before Mr. Justice Grigson. Justice Grigson said, quote, "The enormity of what you've done is beyond words, and, quote, the damage you've done is incalculable. You have not only destroyed the lives of your victims, but you devastated the lives of those who loved them." Mark Hobson appeared to show no remorse for his actions. He then sentenced him. Mark Hobson was jailed for life and given a whole life tariff, meaning that he will never be released. In November 2005, Hobson appealed his sentence to the Court of Appeal, stating he should have got some credit for admitting to the murders at the first opportunity and not putting their families through the ordeal of a trial. This appeal was refused. Mark Hobson started his life in the town of Wakefield, and his life has come full circle, with him being sent to HMP Wakefield, a Category A prison I've mentioned on several occasions, as it's where the most dangerous criminals in the UK are held, and is dubbed the, quote, Monster Mansion. Hobson's guilty plea meant that he didn't have to give an explanation for his crimes in court. However, in 2006, it was revealed that Hobson had begun writing to a former friend, called Donna Kempt, with her saying, quote, "He doesn't like to dwell on the past, but he said that he and Claire rowed on the day he killed her, and he flipped, and he went on to murder them all. It was the booze more than the drugs which sent him over the edge." Hobson reportedly told Donna, quote, "At first I couldn't remember what had happened. Now the memories are coming back, and they do haunt me." Hobson also boasted about how he'd passed his GCSE and A-level in maths, and quipped that one day he would have, quote, "more qualifications than Stephen Hawking." In response to these revelations, Ian Harrison, Diane's partner, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter how many qualifications he gets, he'll never be able to use them. He's never going to be released, and that is it. When he launched his appeal, that really set me back, but now at least I know he'll rot in jail, and when he's dead, he'll rot in hell." George Sanderson, Claire and Diane's father, stated, quote, "It doesn't matter what Hobson says, he's just pure evil. Alcohol doesn't make you do what he did. It's because he's such a twisted person. He can never say sorry to us. We can't even look at our daughter's photographs without thinking about what he did. It's too hard to even talk about it, and whatever he said won't make any difference." Almost 20 years after this horrific quadruple murder, Mark Hobson remains in prison, where he'll spend the rest of his miserable existence. When I was looking into Mark Hobson, I didn't find any indicators of abuse when he was growing up or exposure to violence. These are often factors which result in people developing pro-violent attitudes, which they then display later in their lives. However, just because it isn't obviously written somewhere doesn't mean it didn't happen, as there's likely some reason why Hobson developed to the monster he did, or perhaps he was simply born evil. However, what is clear is that he was trying to excuse his behaviour by saying, "The alcohol made me do it." George Sanderson hit the nail on the head when he said alcohol didn't make him do it, he was just a twisted person, and that's correct. Alcohol and drugs don't create violence, or everyone who used them would start acting in that way. Alcohol and drugs just lower people's inhibitions and allows them to more easily act on their pre-existing violent and aggressive attitudes. Hobson blaming his alcohol and drug use makes no sense. Okay, maybe he was under the influence when he killed Claire, but he planned the death of Diane and had thought through what he needed to conceal their bodies and stop the smell of decay. Instead, I think that Mark Hobson was a man who saw others merely as objects he could use and abuse, and when he got tired of them, he felt the right to simply dispose of them. With regards to Claire, Hobson clearly thought that she was his property, something he could victimize any way he wanted, and this included abusing her in the street in full view of members of the public. He believed that he picked the wrong sister, so rather than leaving Claire and potentially trying to begin a relationship with Diane, as a normal person might do, he decided to get rid of Claire entirely and kill her, like one would dispose of an item they no longer have a use for. However, Hobson wasn't interested in any sort of mutual relationship with Diane. He just wanted to use and abuse her, before again disposing of her like rubbish. I believe what likely happened was that Diane attended the property, Hobson tried to initiate some sort of sexual contact, she rejected him, and he decided that she needed to die. The deaths of James and Joan Britton were completely gratuitous. Both individuals were elderly, and if Hobson's intention was just to rob them, he could simply have threatened them and got what he wanted. Potentially because of their level of vulnerability, he could have just walked in and taken what he wanted, and walked out, knowing full well they couldn't fight back. However, I think he saw two vulnerable people that he could use and abuse, and that he killed them for kicks. He knew that, when he was caught, he'd be going to prison forever, so thought he would just cause as much chaos as possible. Mark Hobson is just a cowardly, evil man who has no consideration for the life of anyone else. Potentially he is haunted by what he's done, and I hope that's the case, and I hope that he ends his life behind the confines of prison walls. Just a quick addition. I outlined the behaviours and motivations of domestic abuse perpetrators in my video about the horrific murder of Kellyanne Bates. Check out that video if you have time. In that video, I outlined how domestic abuse perpetrators are ultimately motivated by gaining and maintaining power and control over their victims, using various tactics including violence, threats of violence, verbal abuse, etc. The case of Hobson raises another major warning flag in domestic abuse cases, and that is men who abuse their partners in full view of others, whether this be members of the family or members of the public. Often, domestic abuse perpetrators will try to hide their behaviour, knowing that, if they're seen, someone will intervene. So there is ultimately some semblance within them that they know what they're doing is wrong and they try to conceal it from others. However, some men, especially the most dangerous ones, don't care. They will abuse their partners in any environment. This usually shows two things. Firstly, their normalised view of violence, with them seeing nothing wrong with acting in this way, and also likely their confidence about how much control they have over their victim, with them thinking that even if I beat her up in the middle of the street, she won't report me to the police and I'll get away scot-free. With Hobson, he saw no issue with standing on Claire whilst wielding a knife in the middle of the street. Unfortunately, in the UK, and I assume around the world, many perpetrators do get away with their crimes because their victims refuse to make a statement against them, so any case falls apart. This is often through fear, with the victim fearing that if they do report the crime to the police, then they'll come to serious harm, or potentially even be murdered. However, if you see someone being abused in the middle of the street, there are a few things you can do. Firstly, if it's safe, intervene. I think it's all our responsibility to try and protect people who are being abused by their partners. Secondly, if you see something like this, get your mobile phone out and film it, obviously from a safe distance. This isn't for morbid curiosity, but if you can capture what's going on, it's evidence. And even if the victim doesn't support a case, then you may be able to provide enough information that they can pursue what's known in the UK as a victimless prosecution, where, even if the victim withdraws their statement or complaint, there's enough evidence that people like this can't get away with it. Peter Scully is an Australian national and career criminal who will spend the rest of his life in jail in the Philippines, just committing some of the worst, most depraved, sexually motivated crimes against children the country and the world has ever seen. He is a man without remorse, a monster who abused and tortured children for his own sick sexual pleasure. He filmed and sold videos of his horrific crimes for his own profit. The things this man did almost defy belief. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Peter Gerald Scully was born on the 13th of January 1963 in Melbourne, Australia. I've not been able to find any real information about Scully's childhood or upbringing, but outwardly, he appears to have lived an ordinary life, to a point. Clearly, he was an expert at wearing masks during his life. Scully married and had 2 children, and the family lived in Naree Warren, a suburb of Melbourne. It's not clear when, but Scully left the family home to move into central Melbourne, no doubt to give him space to carry out his criminal endeavours. This included fraud on a large scale, with him being the co-director of at least 2 companies. Outwardly, these were property developers, which obtained $2.68 million in funding to build properties in the city of Ballarat, Victoria. However, there were no properties built, and the money was simply siphoned off. The fraud occurred between around 2004 and 2006, and when the companies eventually folded, they owed approximately $4 million to creditors. The Australian Securities and Investments Commission undertook an investigation in 2009 and found that Scully had committed 117 separate offences of fraud and deception. However, in 2011, before he could be arrested, Scully fled to Manila, the capital of the Philippines. Real estate fraud was not Scully's only criminal enterprise in Australia. He'd also gone to Malaysia and travelled back with a teenage, quote, girlfriend called Ling, although some articles state she was from the Philippines, who would then pimp out to individual clients and force to attend sex parties. A witness recalled Scully locking a completely naked Ling out of their apartment in the middle of the night, apparently as some form of punishment. An associate of Scully's stated, quote, Peter was driven by one thing, money, and it's clear that this is the case, and it's necessary to highlight this point front and centre in order to understand what came next. Scully was clearly a career criminal and a con man, and these individuals often have no empathy for their victims. They see them as a way to make gain for themselves. It seems Scully focused on 2 areas he knew would reap the most rewards: promises of massive gains from property developments and sex, with him willing to use and abuse anyone in any way in order to exploit these opportunities to make as much money as possible. Scully eventually set himself up on the island of Mindanao, living in the city of Cagayan de Oro, and it's here that he began to set up his international child sex abuse ring. Peter Scully is clearly a man who looked for opportunities to make money any way he could, and unfortunately, the Philippines is a notorious place for sex tourists, with many families living in abject poverty, a prime target for paedophiles, who will offer money to elevate the family in exchange for use of their children. In addition, there are an estimated 250,000, quote, street kids in the Philippines who spend their days begging and doing odd jobs in order to buy food. Out of these, around 75% are thought to have families they live with, but 25%, so around 62,000, have no families, no one looking out for them. They live and sleep on the streets, making them a natural target for predators. Unfortunately, the Philippines has become one of the global epicenters for the production and distribution of child pornography due to the ease with which paedophiles can gain access to victims and offend without real fear of being caught. Peter Scully became one of these men. He set up a dark web child pornography website called, quote, No Limits Fun, as a way to distribute the material he filmed to paedophiles around the world. The material that Scully filmed was what is known as, quote, hurtcore pornography, which is a topic that I've touched on before. This material is the worst end of the scale of child pornography, as it not only depicts acts of sexual violence against children, but it specifically tends to include their torture, with the victims often being extremely young, sometimes babies, with the whole point being to cause the victim as much emotional and physical harm as possible. As well as creating this material to sell, Scully would livestream himself raping and abusing children, taking requests of acts he should perform from his sick website members. Scully would seek out victims on his own, but he also had accomplices who would help him find children to horrifically abuse. There are two main ones I want to mention: Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Ann Alvarez, both of whom were about 17 years old when they met Scully, and it appears they themselves have been the victims of sex trafficking. Scully is known to have raped and tortured at least 8 children, but some reports state that the true number may be in the 60s. His most horrific crimes occurred in 2012 when he made a series of short films called, quote, Daisy's Destruction, which have become an urban legend and are considered, by those who've seen it, the worst child sex abuse material ever created. It's material that sickened even the most seasoned investigators and led to many of them suffering PTSD just from viewing it. Please know that all the child victims' names are pseudonyms. Even if I come across their real names, I would not use them. The Daisy's Destruction films depict 3 victims, who were Daisy, then aged 18 months old, Liza, aged 12, and Cindy, aged 11. In these videos, the children are raped and tortured. The most horrific behaviour is reserved for Daisy, who is filmed hung upside down, where she is beaten, burnt, and tortured, including being burnt with hot wax, all while screaming for help. Lizelle Margolo is seen wearing a mask in these videos, inflicting horrific physical abuse on the children. The title card on one of the parts, which specifically focuses on the abuse of Daisy, apparently reads, quote, Come see a child's mental ruin, her innocence lost, used as a tool. She'll learn to please her mistress. Her body will be ravaged, her dignity stolen. Later, the police would track down Daisy, who had suffered severe physical and emotional damage as a result of her abuse as a baby, as well as Liza, who was also similarly destroyed by the experience. However, the child known as Cindy could not be found. Margolo later told authorities that Scully had filmed himself in a separate video with Cindy, who, remember, was aged just 11 years old, and, after raping and torturing her, forced her to dig her own grave before strangling her with a rope. Her remains were later found buried underneath the property used by Scully. Police inquiries found that both Liza and Cindy had been given up by their parents into Scully's care, with the promise of food and a decent education. In the case of Cindy, her mother had died in 2012, and Margolo offered to adopt the child, telling them that she knew a man who could give her a decent future. Instead, this child was delivered into the hands of the devil, who abused and murdered her. Scully would sell these movies online. In the case of Daisy's Destruction, he would apparently sell this for $10,000. Scully raped and tortured other children, including a 5-year-old, and both Lizelle Margolo and Carmen Alvarez were involved in the abuse of these children, specifically their torture. In September 2014, Carmen Alvarez was tasked by Scully with finding him more children to abuse. Here is her speaking in her own words.
He said to me, can we adopt some street kids? And I said, I don't know, I don't think so. What if my sister to live with us? He said to me, no, I don't want your sister, I want a street kid to help them. Then I meet these 2 kids. Then I said to these kids, you want to come with me? And then the kids say, yes.
So you asked them to come home with you?
Yeah.
Because Peter wanted 2 girls?
Yeah.
And did he tell you which age, what age he wanted?
He said he wants 9 and 12.
The 2 girls that Alvarez is talking about were 11-year-old Daisy and her 10-year-old cousin Queenie, who were hungry and hanging around a local shopping centre. After having a meal, she invited them back to Scully's property with the promise of food and shelter. Over the next 5 days, the children were raped and tortured by Scully, who forced them to dig their own graves, with him threatening that, if they tried to escape, they'd be murdered and placed in the holes. They were chained up and forced to wear dog collars, and each day they were taken back to the holes to dig a bit deeper to reinforce to them the consequences of defiance. On one occasion, one of the children woke up in the hole she had dug. She was told she'd been placed there, she'd been making too much noise, and she was crying for her mother. One of the children later said, quote, "I wanted to kill myself. I wanted to die that night because I could not bear it any longer." On the fifth day, Alvarez released the girls, apparently feeling remorse for her role in Scully's crimes, although, in other reports I've read, it stated that the children simply found a way to escape on their own. However, regardless, these two children were able to escape and raise the alarm, telling the police what had happened to them. This led to Alvarez being arrested almost immediately, but Peter Scully and Lizelle Margolo went on the run. On the 20th of February 2015, Peter Scully was tracked down to Balay City in the Philippines and arrested on charges related to the rape and torture of the two cousins in September 2014. However, Lizelle Margolo was nowhere to be found, and she would evade authorities for 2 years. She spent this time apparently living in luxury, using the false name Shannon Carpio, with her presenting herself as the wife of a French software millionaire. She lived in a palatial condominium in the affluent Cebu city. Instead of keeping her head down, she could not help but show off her life, posting vain pictures of herself in revealing clothes online. Margolo would spend lavishly, spending money on designer clothes and luxury meals, telling her friends the money came from her rich husband. Instead, it's believed that she continued to organize the rape of more children, recruiting others to commit these offenses, filming these acts, and selling them online, possibly at the direction of Scully from prison. How she was eventually caught is unclear, but after 2 years on the run, Margolo was arrested and sent to prison to await her fate. Initially, Peter Scully was charged with 6 offences, which included 1 count of human trafficking and 5 counts of rape, charges he denied. However, he was convicted. On the 13th of June 2018, Peter Scully appeared before Judge Jose Escobedo, who sentenced him to life in prison. The judge also sentenced his accomplice, Carmen Alvarez, to life imprisonment. However, it took the combined efforts of several law enforcement agencies to reveal the true scale of Scully's offending. Filipino authorities, Dutch police, and the Australian Federal Police all worked together to identify the victims of Scully's offending, identify him and his accomplices. Part of this involved looking at details which were filmed in order to link them to locations where the abuse had occurred and subsequently to Scully, but this took some time, so it wasn't until 2022 the answer to the other 60 charges which had now been brought against him, including multiple counts of child abuse, human trafficking, rape, and syndicating child pornography. Unfortunately, I've had difficulty confirming whether Scully was charged with the murder of Cindy, the poor 11-year-old girl whose remains were found buried under a property linked to him. Some reports say he was, some don't mention it. However, in subsequent interviews, Scully appears to confirm that he did kill this child. This is more related to him not denying this fact, rather than outwardly expressing his guilt. On the 3rd of November 2022, at Cagayan de Oro Court, Peter Scully was convicted and sentenced to 129 years in prison. Also stood next to him was Lizelle Margolo, who had swapped her designer threads for prison clothes. She was sentenced to 126 years in prison for her part in Scully's crimes. Peter Scully was lucky to escape with his life, as the horrific nature of his crimes led to public outcry and the prosecutors pushed for the death penalty, which had not been used since 2006, to be brought back just for him. From what I can see, Peter Scully, who's now 60 years old, is incarcerated at Cagayan de Oro City Jail, where he's complained about the conditions. Oh, bless him. And he will inevitably spend the rest of his miserable life behind bars. Before speaking about Peter Scully, I want to introduce some clips from an interview with him in 2015.
So when you were on the run, how great was the urge?
Urge for what?
To find young girls.
Hardly ever had an urge. It's not like a hungry dog that's got to feed every 3 hours or 4 hours. It's not like that. And it's really not. It's almost not an urge.
Then why do it?
Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Why would you abuse an 18-month-old child?
Well, for a start, I didn't. And
Well, that's not true, is it?
It is true. No, I'm sorry, you're
Oh,
wrong.
I'm sorry. How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she, Peter?
You are confusing different things. I don't want to get into that.
How old was she?
Huh?
How old was she?
I don't want to get into any of that yet.
Right, okay. Whether that child was 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, or perhaps we're mixing it up with a 9-year-old child or an 11-year-old girl, 12-year-old girl. You've done it to all of them, haven't you?
All right, I will go back to this now. No comment.
What is it about you, Peter, that hates children and women so much?
I might address that in the journal.
It just got crazier and crazier for you and sicker, and you'd already committed murder. Where was it going to end? Like, what was the next level for you?
There was no next level.
And as a parent, how can you reconcile what you've done to children?
Next question, please.
Do you accept that you were ruining their lives as soon as you came in touch with them?
In the journal.
So you really have no sympathy for these people, for these kids?
That is definitely in the journal. I think we are finished.
I think we are.
Okay.
He can get up. Get up, please.
To clarify, Scully mentions a journal, and this is related to him stating, at the time, that he was going to write a tell-all manuscript about his crimes and his feelings around his offending. This is a cowardly move, with him just trying to kick the can down the road when asked specific questions, stating that the answers will come, but not yet, and only on his terms. I imagine this journal would not be free either, and so, again, Scully was looking for an angle to make some money. Whether he ever wrote this journal is unclear. These clips are so interesting, as you can tell the coldness and lack of empathy of Peter Scully. He couldn't even admit, despite what he'd done, which appears to include murder, that he'd ruined these innocent children's lives. I find it particularly disturbing when he says he never molested an 18-month-old, given that he filmed himself doing this. He's clearly trying to argue the age, stating that she was older, and somehow this makes a difference. I like the interviewer pushing back and stating that, was she 2, 3 years old? Pointing out how little difference this makes to the horror that he put this and other children through. I do love Australians. They can be so scathing without raising their voice, and I love the bit at the end where the interviewer tells Scully to stand up and waits for the guards to take him back to the hole he crawled out of. I understand what the interviewer was trying to do. Get Scully to express some level of remorse for his crimes. I think remorse is a somewhat overrated concept after a certain point. Yes, I think you can have someone who has hurt or killed someone in a moment of anger, and then, when the red mist dissipates, they can feel remorse and regret for their actions. But someone who systematically raped and tortured multiple children, and I've no doubt murdered at least one, is clearly a person who doesn't feel remorse, or empathy, or compassion. Otherwise they would not be able to do these things. Even if Peter Scully turned round and said, yes, I have remorse, given the gravity of his crimes, what real difference does such a statement make? Does it make up for the emotional, psychological, and physical destruction he caused? The innocence he took from these extremely vulnerable children? Peter Scully was a man driven by power and his own gratification. In Australia, this came from robbing people of their hard-earned money. I imagine he likely took great pleasure in living the high life and reveling in other people's misery, indicating his sadistic tendencies. I've no doubt that Peter Scully had researched his next project in the Philippines and was putting the pieces in place before he fled there. When he got there, he realised he could exert ultimate power over others through sexual violence, torture, and murder, whilst also making a profit. The children whose bodies he broke were merely objects he could use to live out his sadistic sexual fantasies and get rich from. They were disposable. I have no doubt that Scully is a sadistic psychopath. a man without remorse, and who, if released tomorrow, would go straight back to what he was doing. This man is truly evil, and is clearly one of the most dangerous child sex offenders of modern times. I'll also briefly mention his accomplice, Lizelle Margolo, clearly a sick, sadistic, psychopathic woman who clearly enjoyed abusing these children and living the high life off their misery. I think her current prison surroundings are more reflective of her true standing in life. On Monday, the 24th of May 2010, Peter Gee, a caretaker at the Holmfield Court block of flats in Bradford in the UK, sat down to check the CCTV footage from over the weekend. What he saw would shock the nation, and was something he's unlikely to ever forget. Checking the footage for the early hours of Saturday, the 22nd of May 2010, he saw a man and a woman entering a flat. Minutes later, the woman was caught running for her life, being pursued by the man, who was armed with a crossbow. He then caught up with her, overpowered her, and dragged her back towards the front door of the flat. He then fired a crossbow bolt into her head, killing her, all in full view of the camera. The man then dragged the woman's body back into the flat. He then re-emerged, and this is what the camera caught. The man was Stephen Griffiths, a British serial killer who just killed his last victim. He ended the lives of at least 3 women between 2009 and 2010, and, when in court, proudly called himself the Crossbow Cannibal. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen Sean Griffiths was born on December the 24th, 1969, in the market town of Dewsbury in West Yorkshire in the UK. He was the first of 3 children, to his mother Moira and his father, also called Stephen. The marriage broke down when Griffiths was 13, and the children and Moira moved into a council flat in the town of Wakefield. Griffiths' childhood was anything but normal, and it's clear he was exposed to extremely problematic behaviour, which shaped his future crimes. Specifically, his mother Moira would leave the children alone most nights, going out whilst dressed provocatively, and she would return with different men each time. As one neighbour stated, quote, she would go out in the garden stark naked and have sex with different men in full view of the neighbours. People would complain about it, but she didn't care. Her children, including Griffiths, would also witness this behaviour. Rumours circulated that Moira was a prostitute, and the ridicule from his classmates was something else that Griffiths had to deal with. In addition, Moira was also a criminal, and in 2007, she was convicted of falsely claiming £8,500 in benefits. In contrast, it appears that his father Stephen tried to help his son and saved every penny he could to send him to private school, specifically Queen Elizabeth Grammar School in Wakefield, where tuition is about £10,000 a year. As an aside, this is the same school where the acid bath murderer, John Haigh, was educated before he went on to kill at least 6 people in the 1940s, before dissolving their bodies in acid. Anyway, despite the prestigious education, it appears the damage had already been done, with Griffiths being described as a loner and strange by those who knew him. Griffiths appeared extremely socially awkward, had few friends, and made no real attempt to become part of his school community, or any community for that matter. Instead, it appears that Griffiths, by the point he was a teenager, had devolved into his own little world, which revolved around a fascination with serial killers, violent films, weapons, martial arts, and harming animals. Upon his eventual arrest, Griffiths was found in possession of hundreds of books related to serial killers, such as the Moors murderers, but he appeared to hold particular interest and reverence for the Yorkshire Ripper, Peter Sutcliffe, who murdered at least 13 women, mainly sex workers, between 1975 and 1980. Whilst at school, Griffiths was known to carry a knife in a briefcase and would frequently speak to his classmates about skinning birds and torturing animals. Griffiths spent 3 years at the school, leaving at age 16. I'll break here for a moment to highlight the red flags in this case, which were clear at a young age. So you have a man who clearly grew up in a neglectful household, likely not being exposed to appropriate social skills that he could mirror, who invariably had resentment, likely hatred towards his mother because of her abandonment of him and putting her own needs first, and exposing him to inappropriate sexual activity, and potentially being a prostitute, or at least acting in this manner, which led to him being ridiculed. This, I believe, led to a general hatred of women, and particularly sex workers. In addition, his mother appeared happy to break the law and likely instilled these same values into her children. In response, Griffiths began to live in his own little world, revolving around violence, serial killers, and weapons, all of which I believe represented power and recognition to him, with him perceiving that, in order to get the attention he craved as a child, acts of serious violence, including multiple acts of homicide, were the way to achieve it, to be noticed. It didn't take Griffiths long to start falling foul of the law, with his first conviction coming when he was 17 years old, when he attacked a supermarket manager with a knife when he tried to stop him shoplifting, something Griffiths would do regularly. For this incident, Griffiths was sent to prison for 3 years, and, during this time, he told various professionals, including a probation officer and psychiatrist, that he had fantasized about becoming a serial killer and believed he would begin killing people before the age of 30 years old. In 1989, at age 19, Griffiths was again back before the court for possession of an offensive weapon, specifically a BB gun, which he would apparently use to shoot birds, which he would then take home and dissect. Just 2 years later, in 1991, Griffiths was sentenced to 2 years in prison for holding a knife to a woman's throat. However, I haven't been able to find any information about who this woman was and the particular circumstances. Whilst in prison for this offence, Griffiths' mental health was assessed, and one doctor described him as, quote, a sadistic, schizoid psychopath. The term schizoid refers to a personality disorder which is characterized by an individual wishing to pursue solitary habits, having difficulty expressing emotions and reacting appropriately to situations, and being outwardly humorous, emotionally detached and cold to others, so someone who has little vested interest in society. This, coupled with the sadistic and psychopathic labels, indicates that Stephen Griffiths was an individual who had little connection to society, no empathy, remorse or compassion for others, and derived pleasure from inflicting pain and humiliation onto others. Add on top of this, his obsession with violence, serial killers, and weapons. It's clear that this is the profile of a very dangerous man. The authorities agreed, but there was little that could be done. At that point, Griffiths had not done anything which meant they could take any real action against him. However, they knew he was a ticking time bomb. In around 1997, Griffiths moved into flat 33 at Holmfield Court, a block of flats in Bradford, which is where he will remain until his arrest, and where the CCTV footage I showed at the beginning of this video was captured. Griffiths essentially turned this property into his shrine to murder and violence, adorning the walls with weapons, including samurai swords and crossbows, and amassing hundreds of books about serial killers, as well as violent movies. In 1998, aged 29, Griffiths began dating a woman called Zita Pinder, who he dated for 2 years. She later described him as controlling, not letting her go out with her friends, and generally wanted to know where she was at all times. During the relationship, Griffiths told Zita that he lived with his parents, but she eventually found out that he had a flat and insisted that she went round. When she stepped in, she was disturbed by what she found. She later described coming face to face with his weapons collection and noticing a crossbow simply leaning against the television, as well as hundreds of books on serial killers. Zita stopped seeing Griffiths soon after this incident. Investigators have speculated that this rejection was what finally led to Griffiths turning his back on the world entirely, as it's clear that he was unable to live a normal life and maintain normal relationships. He therefore appeared to completely disappear into his own world, obsessed with violence and destruction. Added to this, I think this incident would have intensified Griffiths' underlying hatred of women and galvanised his behaviour years later. Griffiths expressed his contempt for society online and hinted at the monster he was, with him using the pseudonym Vampire and stating, quote, humanity is not merely a biological condition, it's also a state of mind. On that basis, I'm a pseudo-human at best, a demon at worst. Griffiths was known to be eccentric by his neighbours. He would often be seen walking as lizards he owned on Leeds, but he was also known to be rude and aggressive, and he caused significant issues for the other residents. In particular, it seemed he would try to befriend women, but when he made sexual advances towards them and these were rejected, he'd become aggressive and threatened to kill or harm them. Police were made aware of these concerns, as well as the fact that Griffiths was seen repeatedly reading books on human dissection. Between 2007 and 2009, the year the murders began, police were receiving ever-increasing levels of complaints about Griffiths' behaviour and demeanour, and on at least one occasion, they seized some weapons from his property. However, they believed there was little they could do, so the only thing that occurred was that new CCTV cameras were installed with the hope of gathering evidence to evict Griffiths or potentially had him issued with an antisocial behaviour order. These cameras, however, would eventually capture the murder of a young woman and lay bare the depravity of Stephen Griffiths. It should be pointed out that Stephen Griffiths was an intelligent, educated and cunning man. In around 2003, he obtained a bachelor's degree in psychology and, in 2004, enrolled on a part-time PhD course at the University of Bradford, which he was studying when he was eventually arrested. His thesis was going to be on 19th century murders in the Bradford area, so essentially Griffiths was spending his entire time obsessing over killers and was taking qualifications to be called doctor and become an expert in this field. Anyway, his intelligence is also demonstrated by the planning that Griffiths took before he committed his murders. Firstly, teaching himself human dissection from reading books, but also getting to know his prey, with him starting friendships with sex workers in the local area and often inviting them back to his flat for a drink, meaning that, at the time of the murders, he was known within these circles as a friendly, unassuming man. This was clearly the superficial charm associated with Griffith's psychopathy, which hid his true, horrific intent, which became apparent in June 2009 when he put his plan to become a famous serial killer into action. Stephen Griffiths' first confirmed victim was Susan Rushworth, who was aged 43 and worked as a prostitute in Bradford to fund her addiction to drugs. However, this was not all she was. This is not what any of his victims were, not even close. With regards to Susan, she was a mother of 3 children, a grandmother, and she had other family who dearly loved her. She was last seen alive getting off a bus on the 22nd of June 2009 in Bradford Town Centre. What happened to her is only known through Griffith's confession, with him stating that he met her and invited her to his flat later that day, and, when she was in the property, he beat her to death with a hammer and then dismembered her body in the bathtub. He claimed to have eaten parts of Susan's body after cooking them. He then disposed of her body parts, but has never revealed where. Confirmation of Griffith's story came when DNA analysis in his flat found significant blood splatter in the property, which was identified as belonging to Susan. At 10 p.m. on the 26th of April 2010, Griffith's second confirmed victim, 31-year-old Shelley Armitage, was last seen alive working in Rebecca Street in Bradford's red light district, close to the city centre. It's assumed that soon after this, Griffiths approached her and invited her back to his flat. When she stepped in, she was attacked, and it's believed that she was killed when Griffiths fired a crossbow bolt into her body, but also potentially stabbed her. Police later recovered horrific video camera footage of Shelley's naked and apparently lifeless body, which had been filled by Griffiths. She had the words, quote, "My sex slave," daubed in black spray paint on her back. Griffiths was heard in the video chanting, quote, "I am then Pryor. I'm the bloodbath artist. Here is a model who's assisting me." Griffiths later claimed he cooked and eaten parts of Shelley's body. Griffiths then took Shelley's body to the bathroom and dismembered her, dumping her remains at the River Aire, approximately 40 miles away from the site of the murder. At the end of May 2010, human remains were found in the river and subsequently identified as belonging to Shelley. This included part of her spine, which confirmed that she must be deceased. Her father had to identify his daughter from a screenshot that the police had taken from the video shot by Griffiths, but they were only able to show her face to him due to what he'd done to her body. Heartbreakingly, the family wasn't even able to say a proper goodbye to their daughter, sister, and friend, as almost none of her remains were recovered, and what was found was buried in a child's coffin. The last confirmed victim of Stephen Griffiths was 36-year-old Suzanne Blamires, who went missing on the 21st of May 2010. Suzanne was described as bright and articulate by those who knew her, and she started to train as a nurse when she left school. Unfortunately, she developed issues with alcohol and drugs and turned to prostitution in order to fund her addictions. Suzanne did not have an easy life. In 2011, 2 men were jailed for viciously assaulting Suzanne in December 2009, just 5 months before her death. These men attacked her while she was working in the red light district and repeatedly kicked her in the head and body. Her death is the one that was captured in its entirety on CCTV. And obviously, the full footage has not been released, but screenshots of her last moments are available. These show that at 2:30 a.m. on Saturday the 22nd of May 2010, Griffiths and Suzanne are caught on CCTV arriving at his flat and then entering the lift and walking towards his property. These images are haunting as they show the last seconds of Suzanne's life. Within 3 minutes, Suzanne is captured running away from the flat, with Griffiths stood behind her, having armed himself with a crossbow. This horrific image shows the murderous intent in Griffiths' face as he chases Suzanne and then fired a crossbow bolt into her head, killing her before dragging her body into his flat. It seems that Griffiths may not have noticed the relatively new CCTV cameras which had captured his every move, and when he saw them, rather than shy away, he used this as an opportunity to show his complete contempt for human life, sticking his finger up whilst holding the murder weapon. Griffiths set about dismembering Suzanne's body and again dumped her remains like rubbish in the River Aire, but again only small pieces of her body were ever recovered. Griffiths must have known that the CCTV footage would lead to his arrest, and on Monday the 24th of May 2010, after Peter Gee had seen the video, armed police descended on the flat and Griffiths was waiting for them. As he was arrested, he proudly told officers, "I've killed a lot more than Suzanne Blamires. I've killed loads." Clearly, in Griffiths' sick mind, the main event was about to begin. He now had a captive audience and was going to get the attention he'd always craved. Stephen Griffiths admitted his crimes immediately, and the following clip shows a portion of his interview where the police are trying to establish where he dumped the remains of one of his victims, although it's not clear which one.
And what sort of location have you put them in? If you can't tell us where, what sort of location have you put them?
I don't know. Where a robot, where a computer would put it. You know, a rational, emotionless aberration would put it.
Why did you feel the need to kill her?
I don't know. I don't know if I say just sometimes you kill someone to kill yourself or kill parties. I don't know. That's like deep issues inside me.
So why did you feel the need to kill any of the girls? Van?
I don't know. Well, I'm misanthropic. I don't have much time for the human race.
There's so much to unpack here. Part of Stephen Griffiths' tone of voice is down to his Yorkshire accent, but it's also clear that he's indifferent to the suffering he's caused. He's almost bored by the interview. I imagine this is because he's having questions fired at him and he's not in control, which is not the sort of attention he wanted. Stephen Griffiths was subsequently charged with 3 counts of murder and remanded into custody to await his day in court. On the 28th of May 2010, Stephen Griffiths made his first appearance at Bradford Magistrates Court, a formality in the UK for a case such as this, before it's committed to the Crown Court. During these types of hearings, the accused simply confirms their name and their address. When asked his name, Griffiths said, quote, "The crossbow cannibal." This invariably caused shock in the court and sickeningly deep distress in the victims' families who were in the court to see the man who killed their loved ones. On the 21st of December 2010, Stephen Griffiths appeared before Mr. Justice Openshaw at Leeds Crown Court and entered guilty pleas to the murders of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage and Suzanne Blamires. Justice Openshaw stated that Griffiths had committed, quote, wicked and monstrous crimes, and stated, quote, the circumstances of these murders are so wicked and monstrous, they leave me in no doubt the defendant should be kept in prison for the rest of his life. He then sentenced him. Stephen Griffiths was sentenced to a whole life order, meaning that he will never be released from prison. I'm tempted to refer to Stephen Griffiths as a pathetic, attention-seeking loser, and, whilst this is not very professional or a clinical description, I believe it's accurate. I've already given some of my thoughts about him, in that I think that his troubled childhood led him developing a hatred of women, specifically prostitutes, and, whilst he appeared to have contempt for society as a whole, these individuals represented, in his mind, an even lower form of life. Killing them served two purposes. First, it eradicated these type of people from society, but also gave him the attention he desperately craved, with him inevitably fantasizing about receiving the same notoriety as the serial killers he idolized. However, I don't believe that Griffiths was a cannibal. I've not seen any evidence, i.e. forensics of kitchen utensils, etc., which should indicate that this was true. Instead, I think it's interesting that Chaig, the acid murderer who went to the same school as Griffiths, made similar claims after his arrest, with him stating that he'd drunk the blood of his victims. He later admitted this was a lie. I think that he was trying to set up a defense of insanity to avoid the hangman. That one didn't work, but also to shock others and revel in his crimes. I think the same is true of Griffiths. Calling himself a cannibal was his way of shocking people, gaining notoriety and making himself feel big and powerful, whilst also compounding the horror that his victims' poor families had to endure. However, recognition and attention only last so long, and it's reported that Stephen Griffiths has attempted suicide on repeated occasions since his imprisonment, including going on a 120-day hunger strike in 2011. It appears that Griffiths would act in this manner when other high-profile prisoners were getting attention in the press, so he clearly was desperate to refocus attention to himself. Griffiths was also attacked in prison in 2019, during which a prisoner stabbed him in the chest with a wooden spear they'd made. If that's not poetic justice, I'm not sure what is. Stephen Griffiths is currently 53 years old and will spend the rest of his miserable life in prison, which is exactly what he deserves, hopefully slipping into obscurity and eventually nothingness. The women he killed are, unfortunately, defined by their profession in the press, which really irks me. It took me a lot of research to find information about them outside of this, but they were mothers, daughters, sisters, grandmothers and friends to people who loved them and who mourned their passing. They inevitably had aspirations to their life, but fell on hard times and were forced to make decisions which I imagine they hated, but saw that they had no choice. They were human beings who did not deserve to have their lives ended in such a horrific manner. Their names again were Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamires. These women deserve to be remembered. Their lives mattered, and I hope they rest in peace. Stephen Pauls is a British serial killer and serial rapist who murdered a minimum of 4 men between 2014 and 2015. However, he is known to have begun drugging and raping men from at least 2012. He met all of his victims through online dating applications, leading to him being dubbed the Grinder Killer. There are 2 sides to this story. First, the horrific crimes of Port, but also the inaction of the police, which meant that the victims' families were not taken seriously, and they suffered further pain outside of losing loved ones. Port was also free to kill and kill again. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Stephen Paul was born on the 22nd of February 1975 in Southend, in the county of Essex, to Joan and Albert Port. He also had an older sister, Sharon. There's little information about Port's early upbringing, but no indications of abuse, although it's stated that his father had an issue with homosexuality, and therefore Port kept his attraction to males secret from his parents. Growing up, Port was described as being extremely isolated and considered strange by his classmates, and he was frequently bullied. One of his classmates described her interactions with Port, stating, quote, "He was quiet, shy, and a loner, who sat on his own in class. The other class members were really not nice to him, and sometimes you could see the hurt on his face when they were really nasty. I was the only one that really talked to him because it wasn't right how he was treated. I told him to ignore them. We weren't really friends, as I myself found him a bit odd." After leaving school at the age of 16, Port went to art college, but it proved too expensive for his parents, and he spent 2 years training as a chef instead. Port was described as a strange man, and, despite his 6'5" frame, was extremely childlike, and even in adulthood was immature and liked to play with children's toys. Port lived at home with his parents until his early 30s, but in 2006 moved into his own property, 62 Cook Street in Barking, East London, where he committed his offences and will remain until his arrest years later. It's clear that Stephen Port struggled in the real world due to his awkwardness and general lack of social skills. However, on the internet, he could portray himself as anything he wanted to be and would spend all day, every day online, rarely leaving his flat. On the internet, he claimed to have been a graduate of Oxford University, served in the armed forces, and worked as a special needs teacher in London. None of this was true. It said Port worked for 13 years as a chef at West Ham Bus Depot and also did other work, such as door-to-door sales. Similarly, as opposed to being a balding man in his 30s, Port would post numerous pictures wearing a wig, clearly trying to make himself more attractive to other men, but also making himself look younger. As an aside, the television show Celebrity MasterChef had an episode filmed in West Ham bus station, and Stephen Port appears in the background, albeit briefly. This episode aired in mid-2014, so it was likely filmed earlier that year, or potentially in 2013, so before he committed the murders. However, by this point, he was already a rapist, and it must have been strange for everyone involved in this episode, knowing that they were standing mere feet away from a future serial killer. Anyway, it's clear that Port was a man obsessed with sex, specifically with younger men, and, at an inquest of one of his victims, it was revealed that he'd sent hundreds of thousands of messages to men on applications such as Grindr, and his neighbours noticed a revolving door of young-looking men going into his apartment. It got to the point where, due to how young the men looked, his neighbours were concerned Port was a paedophile. Port would also use drugs as part of his sexual activities with these men, specifically GHB, the drug originally developed as an anaesthetic, sometimes known simply as G. It's known to reduce inhibitions, increase libido, and sexual sensations become much more intense. It's commonly known as a, quote, date rape drug, due to its ability to cause unconsciousness and memory loss, and also because it's an odourless, colourless liquid that can be easily put in someone's drink without them noticing. However, it's also a highly dangerous drug, and in high enough doses can cause coma or even death. Also found on Port's laptop was obsessive viewing of, quote, date rape pornography, where he would watch scenarios, likely simulated, but potentially not, where men had sex with other men whilst one of them was unconscious. Port would watch hours of this material each and every day. It's clear that Port began to want to replicate this behaviour, and, by 2012, had put his plan into action. It's not clear how many men Stephen Port actually raped, but, in court, the earliest victim he was known to have attacked was a 19-year-old university student who Port met on Grindr in 2012. The pair chatted, and this male went to Port's flat, describing as being, quote, polite and friendly, and that, quote, nothing rang alarm bells. He was then given a glass of wine and noticed congealed powder in the bottom of the glass and immediately believed he'd been spiked. He then became dizzy and disorientated before losing consciousness. He had a vague recollection of being taken into the bedroom, undressed and raped by Port, but was unable to wake himself or fight back. This male was allowed to live and quickly left the property. It appears he was unsure whether what had happened was real or imagined, but when he got to university, he sought medical advice as he believed he'd been drugged. In January 2013, a man called the police and made an allegation that he'd been raped by Port on New Year's Eve 2012, and that he'd done this on several occasions before that. This male said that Port had plied him with drugs and alcohol to the point he was so under the influence he couldn't say no or fight back, and on each occasion, Port had anally raped him. It doesn't appear that Port was arrested for this allegation, and nothing came of it, although an entry was put on the police national computer database. The next victim was a male known only as B in court records. B was aged 20 when he met Stephen Port on a dating site for gay men. B went to Port's flat in Barking in June 2014 and stated that Port seemed, quote, a very nice guy. B was offered a drink and almost immediately fell unconscious. When he woke up, he was terrified and began shouting and screaming for help. Port, rather than calling ambulance, supported B whilst walking to Barking train station. B was in a terrible state, vomiting profusely and hardly able to stand. When they got to the station, they were seen by officers from the British Transport Police, who saw B incoherent, distressed and vomiting. Port told them that everything was okay and that B had just taken GHB. In court, it couldn't be proven that Port had actually raped B. However, even if this didn't occur, it was clearly the intention. In amongst the crimes against these two men, Port also repeatedly drugged and raped a male known only as C. A couple of things can be taken from this. Firstly, it's clear that Port was drugging men at least 2 years before he began committing the murders, with the intention of raping these individuals. This makes me certain he must have raped far more men than we know about, as it's unlikely that a man this obsessed with sex and heavily invested in date rape porn would have such large gaps between his offences. Unfortunately, there are likely significant issues of shame with these victims, who likely could not recall their attacks and potentially convince themselves that any physical injury they suffered was as a result of consensual sexual activity they could not remember. Others may have felt they could not report it for other reasons, i.e. already being in a relationship, or potentially they felt the police wouldn't take them seriously, which unfortunately, given what happened after this point, seems to be a concern well-founded. Secondly, the first victim referred to seeing powder in his drink. I think that Port was experimenting with different drugs for years to determine which would be the most effective at disabling his victims. GHB is a white crystalline powder in its raw form, but it's never normally solved this way. Instead, it's mixed with water to create a liquid solution. So whatever you put in the first victim's drink was something else. I think he then switched to GHB because it's harder to detect and potentially much more effective. Lastly, I think that Port saw the attack on B as a mistake, and that due to his screaming and crying out for help, he was forced to accompany him to the train station, and there he came across the police. I think that Port saw this as a close call, and he believed he needed to ensure this would never happen again. He needed to make sure his victims were completely under his control, with no chance of escaping. He could not risk being caught again walking the streets with someone he'd just drugged. So Port decided that these men would not leave his flat alive. Within days of the incident with B, Port was again on the prowl, and over the next year, he engaged in a campaign of rape and murder driven by his deviant and predatory sexual appetites. Stephen Port's first confirmed murder victim was 23-year-old Anthony Walgate. It wasn't pronounced Anthony. Anthony was 23 years old and originally from Hull, a city in East Yorkshire, but he moved down to London in order to attend fashion college. He was the son of a woman called Sarah Sack, a woman whose grit and determination is central to the eventual downfall of Stephen Port. Unfortunately, Anthony was struggling financially and so turned to escorting to make money. On the 17th of June 2014, he was contacted by Stephen Port, who arranged sexual services in exchange for payment of £800. It should be noted that Port had no personal savings, and therefore he clearly had no intention of paying Anthony. Anthony travelled to Barking Station, where the pair met at approximately 10:15 p.m, and then went back to Port's flat. What happened next is known only to Port, but it's clear that soon after arriving, Anthony was given a fatal dose of GHB, likely in the laced drink, and he fell unconscious. Whether Port raped him whilst he was alive, dying, or indeed dead is unclear. The next day, Port stayed in the flat with Anthony's body and then went to work a late shift. He returned at 4 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014 and, after dressing Anthony's body, dragged him outside, propping him up by a wall right next to the entrance to the flat complex. Port took Anthony's mobile phone so that their communications could not be seen, plunged a small bottle of GHB on his body, and then made the following anonymous 999 call.
Emergency ambulance. What's the address of the emergency?
There's Cook Street. There's a young boy. Looks like he's collapsed outside. I don't know.
Outside of which number?
4758.
Sorry?
4758, I think.
47 Cook Street.
Yeah.
What area?
Barking. It looks like he's collapsed or had a seizure or something. He's always just drunk. But, yeah.
Okay. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
I'm just pulled up in the car. I've got to get my card on the parking. Oh.
That's alright, don't worry about that. What's the telephone number you're calling from?
Just before 8 a.m. on the 19th of June 2014, paramedics and the police attended, and it was clear that Anthony was dead. Suspicions were raised almost immediately, as Anthony was in a sitting position cross-legged, with the paramedics who attended believing that if he'd have simply died from a seizure, he would not have been sat bolt upright. He would likely have slumped over. Also, it was clear that Anthony had been dead for some time. It appeared clear that he died somewhere else, been moved, and then posed. In addition, whilst a small detail, Anthony's underwear was on back to front, which his friends said was never something he would do due to being fashion conscious. At a later inquest, it appears the paramedics did raise their suspicions with the police, but nothing was acted upon. An autopsy showed that Anthony had died from a drug overdose. Sarah Sack was on holiday in Turkey when her son died, and she rushed back to the UK when she heard the news. Her contact with the police was appalling, with the initial phone call telling her son had died apparently lasting only a few minutes, and it was clear there was no investigation into her son's death. The family liaison officer assigned to her had apparently written that Anthony liked to drink and had, quote, dabbled in drugs, specifically cocaine, something Sarah vehemently denied later. Sarah battled the police for months, insisting that her son was murdered, and she criticised the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police in London. Port did eventually fall on the police's radar, as, although he'd taken Anthony's mobile, they were able to trace the number of the phone that made their 999 call. Also, Anthony had told a friend where he was going and who he was meeting. This led to Stephen Port being arrested on the 26th of June 2014. At this point, Port's story magically changed. Anthony had been in his property and they had arranged money for sex, but Anthony had then taken GHB in front of him and died. Port said, due to panicking, he dragged him outside, propped him up, and then called 999. Alarm bells should have been ringing. Port was clearly lying to the police on at least one occasion. Also was the fact that Anthony had been dead for some time when he was found. He also had no history of using GHB, and if anyone had bothered to look into Port, they would have seen an allegation of rape against a male using drugs in 2012. However, none of this was done, and Port was only charged with perverting the course of justice due to making false reports to the police, and he was released on bail. Another major mistake was the police seized Port's laptop, but it was not examined for 10 months. If it had been checked before, they would have found multiple searches for date rape porn. Within 5 weeks, and while still on bail, Port committed his second murder. Gabriel Kovari was aged 22 and born in Slovakia, but moved to the UK in June 2014 for a better life. I was hoping to work for the NHS as a translator. Despite only being in the UK for less than 2 months, Gabriel saw the best and unfortunately the worst in people. He originally met a man called John Pape in July 2014. The pair developed a friendship, as opposed to a relationship, and Gabriel moved in with him. Although their friendship only lasted 6 weeks, the pair became close. John was upset when on the 23rd of August 2014, Gabriel moved out, having told him he'd met a man online who'd offered him a place to stay. This man was Stephen Port. It's clear that Port had sexual intentions towards Gabriel as soon as he moved in, with him sending a text to a neighbour telling him he should come round and meet, quote, his new Slovakian twink flatmate, and that he was, quote, taking good care of him, suggesting there was more than just friendship going on between the pair. However, it appears that Gabriel soon regressed his decision, as he was not attracted to Port and had been sleeping on the sofa, but knew that Port would try to get him into bed. Sometime after 5 a.m, on the 25th of August 2014, Stephen Port administered a fatal dose of GHB in order to rape Gabriel. Port then took to covering his tracks, including using a false identity online, contacting Gabriel's friends, telling them that Gabriel had left the country. By chance, later in the day on the 25th of August 2014, Port's sister rang and later stated in court that her brother was distressed because there was a dead young man in his room. Port, the pathological liar that he appears to have been, later stated in court that the dead young man that he referred to in the conversation with his sister was Anthony Walgate, who had died over a month before, and that he was apparently having some sort of flashback. Absolute bollocks. Gabriel's body remained in the flat for some time, clearly whilst Port tried to figure out his next move. In the early hours of the 28th of August 2014, Port transported Gabriel's body, lightly wrapped in a bedsheet, to St Margaret's churchyard, approximately 500 metres away from his home. He then placed Gabriel against a wall in a sitting position. Port posed him, placing a pair of sunglasses on his face so someone who saw him at a distance would think he was just asleep. At around 6 a.m. that day, so a few hours later, a woman called Barbara Denham was walking her dogs past a graveyard where she saw a young man sat up against a wall who she thought was asleep. She called out, but there was no response. She then went up to him and touched him, and concerned that he may have been dead, called the police. Again, a bottle of GHB had been plastered on Gabriel's body. Police attended, and it was clear that Gabriel was dead. For some inexplicable reason, the death was determined to not be suspicious, with them assuming that Gabriel had accidentally taken a fatal dose of GHB and simply died where he was found. No post-mortem was conducted, and Gabriel's body was released to his family overseas for burial. John Pate was informed of the death of his friend and was in shock. He had no indication that Gabriel was a drug user, and he raised his concerns about the conclusions drawn by the police. He pointed out the similarities between the death of Gabriel and Anthony Walgate. Specifically, how strange it was that two young men should die of an overdose of the same drug within 500 metres of each other in less than 2 months. The police ignored his concerns. The police also stonewalled Sarah Sack, who was still trying to be heard about her son. She too had heard about the death of Gabriel and was convinced that there was a link to her son's death. Of course, she was correct. But she was ignored. So Stephen Port was in the clear and free to kill again and to claim his third victim. Daniel Whitworth was a 23-year-old chef who had his whole life ahead of him. He lived with his partner, but unfortunately was also using dating websites for gay men. And on the 18th of September 2014, he travelled to Barking train station and met with Port, and the pair went back to his flat. Sometime over the next few hours, Daniel was administered with a fatal dose of GHB and raped. Whilst Daniel lay dead in the property, Port began to cover his tracks. He deleted his dating profile and wrote an apparent suicide note, which he then planted on Daniel's body before, under the cover of darkness on the evening of the 19th of September 2014, he took Daniel's body to the same graveyard where he dumped Gabriel's remains. The next morning, a dog walker found his body. Not just any dog walker, Barbara Denham, the same woman who found the body of Gabriel a month before. She later reported her utter disbelief at being confronted by the same situation again. She approached Daniel's body, which was again propped up against the wall, touched his stomach, felt that he was cold, and then called the police for a second time, saying she'd found a body. The body of Daniel was literally 5 feet away from the spot where Gabriel's body had been found. Police attended and determined there was nothing that could be done for Daniel. Again, he was found with a bottle of GHB on him, but if they bothered to check, they would have found Port's DNA on his jacket from where he'd been redressed after being murdered. They also found an apparent suicide note, which read, quote, "I'm sorry everyone, mostly to my family, but I can't go on anymore. I took the life of my friend, Gabriel Klein. We was just having some fun at a mate's place, and I got carried away and gave him another shot of G. I didn't notice while we was having sex, he had stopped breathing. I tried to get him to start breathing again, but it was too late. It was an accident, but I blame myself for what happened. I didn't tell my family I went out. I know I would go to prison if I went to the police. I can't do that to my family, and at least this way, I can at least be with Gabriel again. I hope he will forgive me. By the way, please do not blame the guy I was with last night. We only had sex, then I left. He knows nothing of what I've done. I've taken what G I have left with sleeping pills, so if these kill me, it's what I deserve. Feeling dizzy now, as took 10 minutes ago, so hoping you understand my writing. I dropped my phone on my way here, so it should be in the grass somewhere." This whole situation, but especially the note, should have been a massive red flag. Firstly, you have 3 young men, all found dead within 500 meters of each other, 2 of them mere feet apart, in the space of 2 months. None of whom were known to be regular users of GHB. If proper checks had been done, they would have found it odd that Daniel apparently was so bereft at killing his good friend Gabriel that he got his surname wrong, calling him Klein instead of Kavari. Also, they would have found the whole situation very odd, considering that Daniel had never even met Gabriel, and there was no evidence they even knew of each other's existence. Also, what an oddly phrased suicide note, with the man apparently in the throes of grief and utter despair that he'd taken the life of his friend, but he takes time to mention the man he just had sex with and says not to blame him. Blame him for what? Why even mention that at all? Clearly mention of sexual activity between Gabriel and Daniel in this note was to make the police think that any evidence of this would be explained. In addition, if they'd bothered to check the phone records of Gabriel and Daniel, they would have seen they were nowhere near each other on the date that Gabriel died. Clearly, Stephen Port thought he was very clever, trying to pin Gabriel's murder on Daniel, but this note is amateur hour for the reasons I've mentioned, and this should have launched a major investigation due to the overwhelming evidence that a serial killer was operating in the area. But nothing happened. Sarah Sack was still fighting for justice for her son, but was also now fighting for the families of both Gabriel Kavari and Daniel Whitworth. The families united and continued to put pressure on the police to take things seriously and actually investigate crimes, but they were all ignored. However, there is shocking evidence of very underhanded tactics employed by the police. In particular, in the case of Daniel's death, police records claim that the handwriting in the suicide note was confirmed as being a match to Daniel by his family, something they stated never happened. So the police chalked his death up to a suicide and made no attempts to investigate further. Stephen Port apparently did not kill again for a year, but he continued to drug and rape other men. He attacked at least 3 men, known as males D, E, and F. Male D was extremely vulnerable. He met Port in January 2015 and had his drink spiked at his flat and was then raped. Port filmed the rape, then showed it to D, who was obviously horrified. At this point, there's a gap of a few months in Port's offending, but this is only because he finally went to court for perverting the court of justice related to the death of Anthony Walgate. On the 23rd of March 2015, Port was sent to prison for 8 months for this offence. The court had no idea the man they were sending down for this simple offence had killed at least 2 people and raped multiple men. Port was released on June the 4th, 2015, and within a month had attacked another man. This was E, who was 35 years old and who met Port on Grindr in July 2015. By this point, Port appears to have been experimenting with different ways to drug men, and so, with the pair were at his flat, Port used a syringe to inject drugs straight into the anus of E. He felt a burning, painful sensation and immediately knew something was wrong. He got up, dressed, and left. Male F was already known to Port, and they reconnected via Grindr in September 2015. Again, F went to his flat, but he made it clear he did not wish to do any drugs. Under the pretense of applying lubrication, Port again injected drugs directly into F's anus. He felt a burning sensation and started to feel lightheaded, but luckily did not fall unconscious and was able to escape. Why Port let these men live is unclear, but I think that even he knew that he'd got away with things up to this point and that he couldn't risk having another dead body on his hands. However, his murderous impulses took over and he would claim another victim soon afterwards. Jack Taylor was a 25-year-old man who lived with his parents in Dagenham and worked as a forklift driver. On the 12th of September 2015, Jack went out drinking with his friends. He then went home and accessed Grindr and began speaking to Port, and they agreed to meet at Barking train station. This haunting CCTV footage shows the pair meeting and walking back to Port's flat, essentially Jack's last walk. I don't know about you, but there's part of me that just wants to shout, telling Jack to stop and go home, however ridiculous that might sound. What happened in Port's flat will never be known for certainty, but it's clear that Jack was drugged and raped and was dead by 7:30 a.m, so around 4 hours after meeting Port, as he then began covering his tracks, deleting the Grindr app from both his and Jack's phone in order to delete the messages. Jack's body remained in the flat the entire day of the 13th of September 2015, and when it got dark, Port again carried or dragged his body to the same graveyard where he disposed of his last two victims. He placed Jack's body propped against a wall, again just a few feet away from where he dumped Gabriel and Daniel, but this time on the opposite side of the wall. Port planted a bottle of GHB on Jack, as well as a syringe, and took his phone, dumping it. Jack's body was found by a passerby, this time not the same dog walker as before, and the police were called. Again, stunningly, they appeared to take the evidence at face value and determined that Jack had probably taken a fatal overdose, potentially accidentally. Case closed. Jack's family were informed of his passing and were adamant that something was wrong. They stated that Jack had aspirations of becoming a police officer and so was very firmly anti-drug. It got to the point where Jack's family were doing their own investigation, compiling their own handwritten evidence and sending it to the police. However, they, like Sarah Sack, who was still banging down every door and calling everyone she could, were ignored, with the police stating there was no reason to link Jack's passing to any of the 3 previous deaths in the last 16 months. It appears that Stephen Port was caught by chance in the end. A detective reviewing the death of Anthony Walgate happened to see the CCTV footage of Jack Taylor walking from Barking train station with a male. When this detective looked at the footage, he realised the person walking with Jack was Stephen Port, a man who'd been involved in the case of Anthony. At this point, the pieces finally fell into place, with links being made with all the victims and Port, and his background was properly checked and the content of his laptop reviewed. A new team of investigators were assigned, and finally, on the 15th of October 2015, Stephen Port was arrested on suspicion of 4 counts of murder. He was interviewed the next day, and whilst he didn't go no comment, he gave very little truthful information. I've included the full release clip of the interview, which is 11 minutes long, as I think it's fascinating, but also people who like analysing body language will have plenty of material. If you want to skip it, as I said, it's about 11 minutes long.
So did you have any involvement in the death of the male that we just spoke about a short while ago, Gabriel Cavari or Gabriel Klein?
No, I did not.
At all. Were you involved in administering any drugs or poisons or noxious substances to him?
No, I don't administer drugs to anyone or give drugs to anyone. That's done at the party by someone else. The name I recognised, one of the boys you mentioned before, was he's normally at the parties and deals with administrating drugs.
Who's that, sorry?
Daniel. Recognised him. Sometimes he deals, he hands out the drugs to the guests.
Daniel, this is the male,
yeah,
that we spoke of earlier.
So, it might not be the same guy, I really don't know, but it's the only Daniel I'd know. Or, I mean, I've spoken to him a couple of times at the party, remembering his name. But he does, like when I did, Scott would ask him to pick up guys, take them to the party, and he would stay, but he would stay and minister or do out hand out of drugs, whatever. But I would leave, but he would stay.
And did you go with Daniel to meet people?
No. I knew he was doing the same as I was, but I'd see him at the party and had a brief conversation with him about it. But I've never actually engaged with him outside of the place.
Outside of the party? And which parties were these?
Scott calls the fat parties.
Scott's parties?
Yeah.
The fat party?
Fat party, F-R-A-T.
Frat parties. So when was the first occasion that you met the person that you're talking of, someone that you know as Daniel?
I think I was on the first few occasions I was there. It was the first time I photographed for Scott, and Daniel was there. So I don't even know if it is the same Daniel we're talking about, but he's the only Daniel I can recall as such. I think his name was Whitworth. It rings a bell, but
you think his name was Whitworth?
Yeah. I mean, if he's tall, almost as tall as me, with brown hair, slim.
Might help if I show you a picture. I'll call this CRT. See, this is Jack Taylor. Do you recognise that, mate?
No. No, I just don't recognise him. No. I don't pay full attention to the guys' faces when I have paid attention to the parties. But I don't recognise his face.
So you don't recognise his face?
I do not know. No.
And I mean, that's Jack Taylor, so you don't recognise
No, I don't.
Jack Taylor.
No.
So, have you ever slept with this male?
No.
Had sexual intercourse with him?
It doesn't look like the type I would go with myself.
He's not the sort of person you'd go for?
No, I tend to more. It's more younger, drinky boys, more younger boys, but not. He looks older. He could be similar to the type I've taken to parties, but I don't recognise him as being one of them.
So you don't recognise him as being one of them?
No.
No. Okay. And Jack, again, was found dead. This was on the 14th of September, 2015. Stephen, did you have any involvement in his death?
I did not know. No.
Did you kill Jack Taylor?
Did not know. No.
Did you administer any drugs or noxious substances to him
I did not know.
with the intention of causing him harm?
No. No. Definitely not. No.
No. And you say you've never seen him before. Is that right?
That's right.
That's right. Okay, I've got another map here, CRT8. I'm just trying to show you as many maps of the area because it's not easy to get it all on one piece of paper, just so that we're clear really. And again, it shows your home address, and it shows the church St Margaret, and behind it you've got the abbey and the primary school. In particular, the area around the walls of the abbey. Have you ever had any reason to go into that area?
No.
Have you ever been through into the abbey?
No, I haven't. No. No, I don't generally go to the church areas. No. No. I think once went to that church with my ex-Danny. Went to the church on a Christmas day, and into the church. But that's as far as I got. As far as I.
You've not been into the grounds behind it, where you've got the old abbey walls.
No, gosh.
No grounds there.
No, it's a spooky, so I won't go there.
You've never been in that.
No.
In all the 8 years that you've lived across the road from the park.
I thought it was all private. I wouldn't go there. I think it's a private area. It belongs to the church.
It's fairly open, isn't it, when you go past? Would you agree with that or not?
But the field's, yeah, the field is. But the church bit behind the walls, we won't go past there.
Because 3 of the 4 people that have been found dead were found slumped up against the wall here of the abbey.
Gosh.
Pardon?
Yeah, I didn't know that.
You didn't know that? So that's news to you, is it? Did you put them there?
No.
So obviously Anthony was found slumped outside your address with a large amount of GHB in his system. The other 3 men we've been discussing were all found over by the wall area of the abbey. We can see on the map. Again, all of them were slumped against the wall with a large amount of GHB in their body. Can you account for that at all?
No, I can't.
I mean, Stephen, did you write this letter here, CRT 11?
No, I didn't.
The photos of it that's found with Daniel.
No. No. Definitely not.
Are you telling us the truth, Stephen?
I'm telling you the truth, yes.
About the letter?
Yes. 100% truth.
About all of these boys?
Yeah.
Young boys? In the early stages of their youth, really, in terms of in their early 20s. All found dead. Stephen?
Yeah, I understand, but...
Close to your house. One of them had been in your house, either just before or at the time when he died, and was found to have large quantities of a drug in his system. The other three were all found just over the road in the churchyard, or just beside the churchyard in that area that we've discussed,
yeah.
Propped up against a wall, short distance from your house, all again with high levels of GHB in them, enough to kill them. Highly unusual way to die for one person. This is 4, all found very close to where you live. All men, young men, type of men that you say that you find attractive. All now dead, Stephen.
As it happened, Anthony, I know nothing about the other three, how they come to be.
Stephen, this is serious.
Yes, I know.
Okay. It's really important that you tell us the absolute truth.
Yeah. Yeah. Have you told yourself always true?
Stephen Port pleaded not guilty to all offences and, in October 2016, went on trial at the Old Bailey in London. Port tied himself in knots, and his claims changed rapidly, with him saying that he didn't know the victims, to admitting that he did, and then saying that they were in his flat and that apparently all of them had taken overdoses of GHB in front of him. The court did not believe him, and Stephen Port was found guilty of the murders of Anthony Walgate, Gabriel Cavari, Daniel Whitworth, and Jack Taylor. He was also found guilty of drugging with the intention of raping, or actually raping, 7 men between 2012 and 2015. On the 25th of November 2016, Stephen Port was set for sentencing before Mr. Justice Openshaw, who, whilst running through Port's long list of offences, stated, quote, "Self-evidently, the defendant is highly dangerous." He then sentenced him. Justice Openshaw stated, quote, "I had no doubt that the seriousness of the offending is so exceptionally high that the whole life order is justified. Indeed, it is required. The sentence, therefore, upon the counts of murder is a sentence of life imprisonment. A decline to set a minimum term. The result is a whole life sentence, and the defendant will die in prison. Therefore, Stephen Port joined the list of prisoners in the UK who will never be released. To this day, he continues to maintain his innocence for his offences." After Stephen Port was caught, and due in large part to the victims' families, the Metropolitan Police referred itself to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, the IOPC, and an investigation was launched. The police looked at the involvement of 17 officers involved in Stephen Port's case and found that 9 had demonstrated performance which had, quote, fallen below the standard required. They were reprimanded for, quote, performance failings, but allowed to remain in service. And, to add insult to injury, in 2021, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that 5 of these officers had been promoted. The coroner's inquest stated that inaction in the investigation of Anthony Walgate's death, quote, probably contributed to the deaths of the other 3 men. In June 2022, the IOPC stated they'll be launching a fresh inquiry into the police's handling of the Stephen Port case, but given that the original investigation took 2 years, there'll be no answers quickly, and by the time a report is published, potentially these same officers will have been promoted again. I think the term probably is indicative of British culture, with us being very polite and not wishing to offend. I'll leave it to my viewers to determine what they think, but I would say the police failings definitely led to Port being allowed to kill and rape people after his first murder. All of the victims' families and friends accused Metropolitan Police of institutional homophobia. They also pointed out how inevitably the police would have handled this case differently if the 4 victims had been women. I think it's horrific that the family and friends of these young men had to basically put their grief aside in order to become detectives, because the people whose job it actually was to do this were so useless. Total respect then. So, what could be said about Stephen Port? What was the thinking of this serial murderer? I think that ultimately Port's behaviour was driven by inadequacy. He was a man who had poor social skills, a menial job, and, at quite a young age, was losing his hair. These are clearly things that Port wasn't able to come to terms with, so he had to project lies about success on the internet and walk around with a wig in order to project the man he wanted to be, not the person he was. The internet was his escape. On there, he could be anyone he wanted. He could feel a sense of belonging and acceptance, likely from the thousands of men he interacted with online. It's common for men and women who have significant issues with their self-esteem to use sex as a way to make themselves feel better temporarily. In these moments, they feel wanted, and temporarily they can forget about how they actually feel. Chasing this feeling can become addictive, and it's clear that this was the case with Stephen Port. While Stephen Port is known as the grinder killer, he used around 10 different dating websites and apps and was obsessed with filling his life with sexual encounters, which I think were an escape from his daily life. I think that Port being described as childlike is also a relevant part to understanding him. As a child, we are taught self-control and that we can't have everything we want. Port appears to have learnt neither of these things. However, I think that as time went on, this didn't have the same impact on Port. The high of meeting random men for sex was starting to wane. He needed to escalate his behaviour. Port became obsessed with rape pornography. I think watching this gave him an idea of how to use sex to have control over another human being, and he started to replicate what he'd seen. He also took people's lives, which was the ultimate demonstration of his power over them. I imagine that Port was most likely ecstatic going through the list of men online, thinking about who he could have sex with their level of consent meaning nothing. They were just objects to use and abuse. When he met them, it didn't matter that he had extremely poor social skills, or was very odd, or wore a wig. They wouldn't live long enough to mock him about these things. He was in complete control. Once he had finished with one victim, he dumped them like rubbish, before moving on and looking for more men to drug, rape, and murder. Watching footage of Stephen Port makes me realise just how good Stephen Merchant's performance was in the 2022 series called 4 Lives, which, if you can find it, is well worth a watch. I think it's still on BBC iPlayer. In my opinion, Stephen Merchant perfectly captures the strange, lumbering demeanour of Port, but also hints at something else, especially during the court scenes, extreme violence and anger. And I think deep within Port, despite his quiet and shy demeanour, is a core of anger and violent tendencies which he had no desire to control. Stephen Port is inevitably a psychopath, and, if released, I have no doubt he would keep killing. However, he'll never get the chance, as Stephen Port's life will end behind prison bars. So, what are your thoughts? Catherine Nice is an Australian murderer and the first woman in the country to be sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. She was a domestic abuser who emotionally, physically, and psychologically victimised all of her partners, and our last victim, John Price, was subject to violence and threats of murder before his horrific death. In the early hours of the 1st of March 2000, Catherine Knight stabbed John Price to death, skinned and butchered him, cooked his body parts, with her intending to feed them to his children. Welcome to Evil Among Us. Catherine Mary Knight was born on the 24th of October 1955 in the town of Tenterfield, in New South Wales, in the southeast of Australia. She was born into an extremely dysfunctional household, characterised by serious violence, alcohol abuse, adulterous behaviour, and exposure to issues that no child should have to see. Specifically, Knight's father, Ken Knight, was a violent alcoholic who would rape Barbara, her mother, up to 10 times a day. He would also violently assault her. Barbara, in turn, often told her daughters intimate details of her sex life and how much she hated having sex with men. Later, when Knight herself complained to her mother that one of her partners wanted her to take part in a sex act she did not want to perform, Barbara told her to, quote, put up with it and stop complaining. Knight also stated that, from early childhood until she was around 11 years old, she was sexually abused by various male members of the family. This appears to have been widely known, but no one did anything to stop it. While psychopaths tend to embellish stories about their childhood, Knight's claims have been supported by her siblings, who also had to endure this brutal upbringing. As with other children who grow up in similar environments, being exposed to horrific behaviour and having no escape and no one to talk to, Knight internalised everything and was described as a quiet, withdrawn girl who had few friends and tended to keep to herself. There seemed to be two sides of Knight. The first was a model student who got awards for her good behaviour. The other was a bully who had extreme bouts of explosive rage, who would victimise younger children, particularly boys, and would often get into physical fights and attack people with weapons. On one occasion, a teacher had to fend off an attack from her. No doubt these outbursts were a tiny reflection of unresolved trauma she had experienced from watching and being the victim of acts of abuse, and her actions were an indicator of how her early years had shaped her attitudes and beliefs, with her perceiving that violence was a way to dominate and control others. Relationships were not partnerships, but a power struggle, and that men were to be hated and deserved to be abused. Knight left school illiterate and began working as a cloth cutter in a clothing factory. However, she soon found a profession which she described as her, quote, dream job. This was working as a local abattoir, where she began by cutting up bits of offal to then being trained as a butcher. She was extremely skilled in this work and seemed to have a passion for it. However, she seemed to take a morbid fascination in her work and would often stand watching while the pigs came through the production line and were killed. She had a set of professional butcher's knives for work, and she would hang these above her bed, everywhere she lived, all through the years that she was free. This must have looked terrifying for someone who wasn't expecting it, walking into a room and seeing the bed adorned with huge knives, capable of slicing through flesh and bone. As she grew up, Knight's violent behaviour became more frequent and serious, and she would often get into bar fights and even stir up trouble in order to get into physical altercations. She would also frequently suggest knife fights with people that upset her and generally seemed to revel in extreme violence. If Knight's violence towards others wasn't bad enough, her behaviour towards the men that she was in a relationship with was nothing short of sadistic. One of the men that Catherine Knight began a relationship with was David Stanford Kellett, a co-worker at the abattoir, with their meeting in 1973 when she was 18 years old. He's described as a man who liked to drink, and the pair would frequently get into bar fights, with Knight willingly getting involved, with fists flying. In 1974, the pair got married, and Kellett recalls Barbara, Knight's mother, saying the following at the ceremony, quote, "You better watch this one, or she'll fucking kill you. Stir her up the wrong way, or do the wrong thing, and you're fucked. Don't ever think of playing up on her. She'll fucking kill you." That's just what you want to hear on your wedding day, the happiest day of your life. But Barbara was right. Knight was a monster, and Kellett was lucky to survive their 10-year marriage. On their wedding night, Kellett was strangled by his new bride because he didn't perform to her standards sexually. This was a sign of things to come. In early 1976, Kellett returned home one night late from a darts match, only to find that Knight had set fire to all of his clothes and shoes. She then took a frying pan and smashed him around the head. Kellett fled to the neighbour's house, where he collapsed. He had to go to hospital to receive treatment for a fractured skull. During this incident, Knight was heavily pregnant with the pair's first child and was able to use this to emotionally manipulate Kellett to make him think that her outburst was hormonal, and this persuaded him not to press charges. The pair's daughter, Melissa, was born soon after this incident, but the violence continued, and in May 1976, Kellett left Knight, fleeing the domestic abuse he was suffering by moving to Queensland. A few days later, Knight was seen pushing Melissa in her pram, violently throwing the pram from side to side, clearly taking her anger out on the child. She was then admitted to St Elmo's Hospital in Tamworth, suffering from postnatal depression, and she spent a few weeks recovering there. When she was released, it seems like she had some sort of psychotic break, and after placing 2-month-old Melissa on some railway tracks, Knight took an axe and went into town and began threatening to kill several people. Melissa was saved from the tracks by a homeless man, and Knight was arrested and returned to hospital. But, bizarrely, she was not charged with anything and not sectioned. It seems she was in the hospital voluntarily, and so signed herself out the next day. Within 72 hours, Knight had slashed the face of a woman and demanded that she drive her to Queensland to find Kellett. This woman was able to escape at a service station, and Knight then took a young child hostage, holding a knife to his throat. She was eventually arrested by police, but she didn't go down easy and fought them with all of her might. Knight ended up in psychiatric care again and disclosed that, had she got to Queensland, she would have killed Kellett and his mother. David Kellett, likely feeling some sort of guilt or loyalty, moved back to the area after leaving his new girlfriend, and when Knight was released from hospital on the 9th of August 1976, having only spent a matter of weeks getting treatment, she came to live with him. However, it was like returning to the lion's den, and Knight's behaviour became more extreme and unpredictable. Knight would call others, ranting about Kellett, stating she knew he was having affairs. Kellett worked various jobs, and this included being a delivery driver. One day, after coming home from his job, he was awoken by Knight straddling him, holding a knife to his jugular. She said, quote, "Is it true that truck drivers have a woman in every fucking town? Is it? You see how easy it is, Kellett? I could do you right here." Kellett later said in an interview, quote, "I had to talk fast, I can tell you. I was sweating and shaking. I couldn't even push her off. She had one arm across my chest and the knife into my neck. I thought I was gone. I was shit scared. It was the most horrific memory I have." Kellett was continuously abused, and Knight would often randomly swing at his head for absolutely no reason, but she was fully capable of knocking him out. Her diminutive appearance hid an unusually high amount of strength when she was in a rage, which was often. The pair had another daughter in 1980, but then, one day in 1984, Kellett came home from 3 days working away, and he found the house had been cleared out, and Knight and the children were gone. She'd left him without any warning or explanation. David Kellett was clearly bemused by this, but when he realised he was free, he promptly went out and got very, very drunk to celebrate. However, Kellett wished to see his daughters, but they were merely pawns tonight, a way to cause him further emotional pain. Kellett would try and see the children and take them on holiday, but Knight would always come up with an excuse. One daughter he did not see for 10 years, and when he did see her, it became clear that Knight had been poisoning his daughter's mind against him, making claims of abuse. His daughter said, quote, "Mom reckons your dick needs to be cut off, Dad." By 1986, Catherine Knight had found her next victim, partner. At this time it was 38-year-old minor David Saunders. Within months, Saunders moved in with Knight, but kept hold of his flat, a sensible idea as it gave him somewhere to escape to. After only 2 months, Knight's mask slipped as she began abusing Saunders. She was paranoid and extremely jealous. She would spend all of her time with Saunders, and, when she wasn't around him, would create scenarios in her head where he'd be sleeping with other women. When he got home, she would confront him and accuse him of having affairs, and if she ever found out he was spending time with a woman, even on a casual basis, this woman would be the focus of her paranoia and rage. Knight would continuously claim that she was pregnant in order to gain sympathy from others. She would accuse Saunders of cheating on her and that this was particularly heinous as she was pregnant, which she wasn't. Later, Knight would repeatedly call the police on Saunders and go to the hospital and made claims that he'd been beating her and she thought she was pregnant. This never turned out to be true, and hospital staff became used to her lies, but would have to treat her injuries even though they didn't match the type of violence she was talking about. David Saunders would frequently flee to his flat, and it was here that Knight would go searching for him, going to the property and then driving the streets and going to bars looking for him. In May 1987, the pair had a blazing argument, and this spilled into the kitchen. Knight grabbed a knife and ran towards Saunders. He thought he was going to be stabbed, but she ran past him and into the backyard. She then picked up Saunders' dingo pup, aged only 2 months old, and slit the animal's throat. It seems Saunders did not see this brutal act, but came into the backyard to see Knight holding the pup, which had a gaping wound in its neck, with blood everywhere. This act was apparently to show Saunders the consequences of daring to leave her or cheat on her. However, Saunders found himself drawn to Knight and kept returning, where he would suffer repeated violent abuse. He was seen by his co-workers frequently with knife wounds and bruises on his body, and, on some occasions, they would stitch up his wounds. In June 1988, the pair had a daughter, Knight's third child, and Saunders decided the family needed more space, and so he put a deposit on a house. Knight had suffered an injury at work in 1986, and so, after 15 years of working at an abattoir, she was now unemployed, but she was given a sizable amount of compensation. She used this money to decorate the house, and her choice of decor showed her morbid fascination with violence and death. Every inch of the walls and ceiling was adorned with machetes, rakes, pitchforks, animal skulls, animal skins, and rusty animal traps. Knight also collected a sizable number of violent and horror movies, which she would spend much of her day watching. In 1989, the violence David Saunders was subjected to became more extreme, and it was one incident which was the final straw for him. During an argument, Knight accused him of cheating for the 1,000th time, and then hit him in the head with an iron and stabbed him in the stomach with a pair of scissors. Saunders moved back to his apartment and returned only briefly to collect his belongings, finding that Knight had cut up all of his clothes. He then went to ground, staying with friends who were sworn to secrecy, and they denied knowing where he was when Knight inevitably came searching for him. Several months later, Saunders returned as he wanted to see his daughter. He found out that Knight had gone to the police and claimed that she was the victim of abuse from him, and so had been issued with a restraining order, which stopped him from having contact with Knight or their daughter. Sickeningly, Knight had also told this child their father was dead. Between 1990 and 1993, Catherine Knight was in a relationship with a man called John Chillingworth, a 43-year-old former abattoir worker. The pair had a son in 1991. Chillingworth doesn't appear to have suffered anywhere near the same level of abuse as her other victims, and this seems, from what I've read, due to him being physically much stronger than Knight, and he would stand up to her. It seems that Knight thought this man was not someone that she could control, and so began having affairs. In 1993, she began an affair with a man called John Price, who, unfortunately, would not survive his relationship with Catherine Knight. John Charles Thomas Price was born on the 4th of April 1955, and, despite having little schooling, was a hard worker, but also a hard-playing man. He had been driving machinery since he was a child, and spent almost 20 years as a miner. He was known as a likeable man, whose ability to consume alcohol was legendary in the local area. Price had 3 children from his marriage to a woman called Colleen, but they had separated in 1988, with 2 of the children living with him and the 3rd living with Colleen, but they would regularly visit. Price had no interest in getting married again, but was lonely and wanted a woman to come home to. In late 1993, he met Catherine Knight at a bar and was smitten. Soon afterwards, Knight and her children moved in with Price in his. However, within months, Knight began showing her true colours. This became worse as she began to drink more when spending time with Price, which seemed to make her behaviour even worse. The pair would have frequent violent arguments, where Knight would attack Price, sometimes with fists, but other times with knives. Her sexual jealousy was an ever-present feature of the relationship, that she once told a friend, quote, "If I ever catch Pricey playing up on me, I told him I'd kill him and cut his dick and balls off." Knight was obsessed with marrying Price. He had no interest,
and was concerned this was her way of trying to get a hold over him and his property. No doubt this was true. Their arguments would frequently revolve around his unwillingness to marry her, and in 1988, after being refused again, Knight took a video camera and made a video of items that Price had taken from his place of work. She then sent this to his boss, and, as a result, Price lost his job in the mines, which he'd had for 17 years. Price was furious and kicked Knight out, but she always found a way to worm her way back into the property. Catherine Knight also tried to divide and conquer the family, inevitably seeing John Price's children as being a barrier to having ultimate control in the property. With one of the children, Knight told her she was adopted and that Price was not her real father. This devastated the child, and, whilst they were told this was a lie by Price and Colleen, Knight would continue to repeat this lie over and over again, chipping away at this child's self-esteem and trust in their father. Because of this behaviour, Price kicked Knight out, but this was short-lived and she was soon back. Friends saw Knight's unstable behaviour up close, including one day when she was sweeping and Price grabbed her bottom in a playful way. Knight exploded and berated him for treating her, quote, like a slut, before just as quickly acting as though nothing had happened and going back to her sweeping. Throughout the relationship, but especially in 1998 and the beginning of 1999, Price was seen by colleagues with more and more wounds, and would frequently show that knife wounds to his chest where Knight is stabbed in during an argument. In February 2000, Price was subjected to a series of serious assaults, including being stabbed in the chest, and he finally had enough of Knight and kicked her out of the house for the last time. In retaliation, Knight had gone to the police and made various claims against him. On the 29th of February 2000, John Price stopped at Scone Magistrates Court on his way to work to take out a restraining order to keep Knight away from him and his children. When he went to work, he told his workmates what he was doing, and they'd begged him to stay with them rather than returning home. Price left work that day, telling his friends that if he did not turn up for work the next day, then he'd been murdered by Catherine Knight. Unfortunately, Price's comments would come true that very night.
What John Price did not know was that Catherine Knight had already decided to kill him. How dare he not suffer her abuse without complaint? How dare he kick her out onto the street? In Knight's mind, she could do no wrong. It was the men in her life who were always to blame. Price was trying to break free of her control. He deserved to die. On the 29th of February 2000, she began to put her plan in motion, collecting her butcher's knives, which had been freshly sharpened, and bought some new lingerie. Price went out that night and came back at 11 p.m. and got into bed. He was awoken by Knight, who'd let herself in and, unknown to him, hidden a boning knife next to the bed. She was also wearing the new lingerie that she'd just purchased. The pair had sex, and Price appears to have fallen back asleep. At some point in the early hours of the 1st of March 2000, Catherine Knight began stabbing John Price. He quickly woke up and, running on adrenaline, tried to escape the house. He ran out of the bedroom, and Knight pursued him and continuously stabbed him. She aimed at his chest, trying to pierce his major organs. An arterial spray covered the walls and floor as Price tried to make it to the front door. The attack was frenzied, and by the time he got to the front door, John Price had been stabbed approximately 30 times. He managed to make it out of the front door, but was dragged back in by Knight, who carried on stabbing him again and again and again. Finally, after being stabbed 37 times, John Price passed away. However, if the nature of his death was not bad enough, what happened next is almost beyond belief. In order to frame the horror in this case, I'll present the scene as police officers discovered it. They were called us around 6 a.m. when Price's workmates, due to concerns that he'd not turned up to work, came to his house and saw blood on the door. At about 8 a.m, officers entered the property and found blood everywhere, soaked in the floor and splattered all over the walls. On the left, immediately past the front door, was the lounge, and here they found John Price's body propped up with his legs crossed, with his left arm slumped over an empty drinks bottle. However, Price had been decapitated and his corpse had been skinned. Between the lounge and the kitchen was an archway. An officer saw what they thought was some kind of fabric covering the opening. When they got closer, they realised to their horror they were staring at the skin of a human being, John Price's skin, which was hanging from a hook. At her eventual trial, the judge described the skinning of Price, stating that, quote, it was carried out with considerable expertise and an obviously steady hand, so that his skin, including that of the head, face, nose, ears, neck, torso, genital organs and legs, was removed so as to form one pelt. So expertly was it done, after post-mortem examination, the skin was able to be re-sewn on Price's body in a way which indicated a clear and appropriate, albeit grisly, methodology. Moving into the kitchen, the true evil of Catherine Knight was uncovered. On the hob was what the judge called a, quote, sickening stew, with John Price's head simmering on the stove in a pot containing vegetables. On the table were 2 meals which included meat and vegetables. This meat had been taken from Price's buttocks and cooked in the oven. Beside each meal was a card with the names of Price's children on them. This sick monster was intending to feed John Price to his own children. Outside the property was found the remains of a 3rd meal, which was apparently thrown out of the window. It's been speculated, but never concluded, that Knight had made this meal, eaten some of Price's body, found it unpalatable, and thrown it away. On top of a photograph of Price was a handwritten, poorly spelt note written by Knight, which stated, "Time got you back, Jonathan, for raping my daughter." This was a lie. Price had never harmed any of Knight's children. The murder weapon, a large boning knife, was found at the scene. Police knew who had committed the crime and quickly tracked down Catherine Knight. I've read various sources which suggest she was found at a separate location, having left the scene, but others stating that she was in the same property with Price's body. Wherever she was found, Knight had taken an overdose, but it doesn't appear this was a particularly serious attempt to end her life. It was likely a tactic to try and gain sympathy for the police, despite the horror of her actions. Knight was taken to hospital, but quickly recovered and was interviewed by the police while still a patient. As shown by this clip, Knight claimed not to remember anything of the night she butchered John Price, but did remember an incident where she had stabbed him. But notice her language when describing it. It was an accident, and only because Price had been aggressive to her. Once Pricey got off the phone, he started on me, and I was around washing up, and it could have been a fork, a spoon, or anything in my hand. It was a knife that cut your meal with, and I aimed it at him, and it got him. He was leaning closer than what I thought, and my eyesight was bad at that time. I've only had new glasses since then. Despite Catherine Knight claiming she couldn't remember anything, the evidence against her was overwhelming, and she was charged with the murder of John Price. Once she'd been discharged from the hospital, Catherine Knight was remanded into Silverwater Correctional Complex, a maximum security women's prison just outside Sydney. She was notorious in the prison before she'd even arrived, due to the publicity about her crimes. People were surprised, both staff and inmates, that this small, quiet woman could be responsible for such horror. Knight seemed to thrive in prison. She told family members that she loved life inside, and that this was the first time that people were paying attention to her and taking care of her. However, Knight was incapable of not working some sort of angle, and she would tell everyone and anyone how much of a monster John Price was, and how she was the innocent victim, although she could not remember killing and skinning him. However, there's a difference between manipulating others in prison and facing an overwhelming mountain of evidence in court, and this was the challenge facing Knight when court proceedings started on the 2nd of February 2001. She offered to plead to the charge of manslaughter, basically, in her case, claiming that she'd killed Price, but this was not premeditated and apparently something she couldn't remember doing. This was rejected, and her trial for murder was set for July 2001, before being pushed back to the 15th of October 2001. In the months before the trial, Catherine Knight was assessed by various psychiatrists for the defence and the prosecution, and whilst there were some similarities in their assessments, there were obviously substantial disagreements. There seemed to be an agreement that Knight was of borderline low intelligence, but, as stated by an individual who met her, seemed to live her life off, quote, rat cunning, which I believe is trying to imply some sort of innate skills in finding opportunities and exploiting them, scurrying around from place to place, manipulating and abusing others to get what she wanted. They also noted that she had chronic low self-esteem, shyness, difficulty coping with the end of relationships, unstable emotions, difficulty controlling her anger, anxiety when re-experiencing childhood abuse, continued fear of being raped and of her children being sexually abused, as well as avoidance when talking about her own experiences of abuse as a child. The consensus was that Knight was suffering from borderline personality disorder, also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is a lifelong condition where the sufferer has significant difficulties with their thinking and behaviour, including having feelings of chronic emptiness, lack of identity, unstable mood in relationships, a profound fear of abandonment, as well as a tendency to act with violence when confronted with an emotional difficulty in their lives. She was also found to have post-traumatic stress disorder linked to her own experiences of abuse as a child. Whilst the defence seemed to give credibility to Catherine Knight's claim that she could not remember the offence, the Crown countered this and said that there appeared to be no medical reason why she could not remember this incident and that she was lying. Bolstering this case with several points. Firstly, the premeditated nature of the offence. Even if Knight could not remember the killing itself, she had brought the murder weapon with her. Also, the time she spent in her task. Not only killing Price, but she took time to skin him, cut meat from his body, and make meals to try and feed his children. Also, it came out in court that midway through her crimes, Knight had taken Price's bank card, gone to an ATM, and withdrawn money from his account. For a woman who apparently blacked out and was implying she was merely acting on impulse with no control, she seems to have been in control enough to find the bank card, remember the PIN number, and draw the money out in order to make gain for herself. Basically, it was bullshit. Someone claiming they cannot remember their actions, especially when related to really serious offences, is very, very common, and is 99.9% of the time simply a way to avoid taking responsibility, and also a way to remain in control. Yeah, I killed them, but I'm not telling you why. That'll be my secret. A few days after the trial began in October 2001, to the shock of everyone, Catherine Knight pleaded guilty to murdering John Price. Sources I've read say it's never been made clear why Knight did this, as, to this day, she continues to claim she cannot remember killing him. I personally think it's very simple. The case against her was overwhelming. Not only the forensic evidence at the crime scene, but also, it seems, Knight would literally tell everyone who would listen that she would one day kill John Price. She knew she would be convicted, and her only play was to plead guilty in order to get a reduced sentence. However, if this is what she hoped for, she would be sorely disappointed. On the 8th of November 2001, Knight stood before Justice Barry O'Keefe for sentencing. His sentencing remarks spanned 40 pages and took an hour to deliver. During his comments, he reflected on the quote steady hand and grisly methodology Knight demonstrated during the murder, skinning and butchering of Price. He also stated, quote, "The prisoners pleaded guilty to a murder which falls into the most serious category of murders. I'm satisfied beyond any doubt that such murder was premeditated. I'm further satisfied the same way that not only did she plan the murder, but she also enjoyed the horrific acts which followed in its wake as part of a ritual of death and defilement. The things which she did after the death of Mr. Price indicate cognition, volition, calm and skill. I'm satisfied beyond reasonable doubt that her evil actions were the playing out of her resentments arising out of her rejection by Mr. Price, her impending expulsion from Mr. Price's home, and his refusal to share with her his assets, particularly his home, which he wanted to retain for his children. I have no doubt that her claim to amnesia forms part of her plan to effect madness in order to escape the consequences of her acts and to provide a convenient basis on which to rely to avoid detailed questioning by the police and escape punishment. As I've said, the prisoners showed no mercy whatsoever to Mr. Price. The last minutes of his life must have been a time of abject terror for him, as they were a time of utter enjoyment for her. At no time during the hearing, or prior thereto, did the prisoner express any regret for what she had done, or any remorse for having done it, not even through the surrogacy of her counsel. Her attitude in that regard is consistent with her general approach to the many acts of violence which she had engaged in against her various partners, namely, they deserved it. In addition, the prisoner's history of violence, together with her flawed personality, caused me to conclude, along with Dr. Milton and the other psychiatrists called in this case, that she is without doubt a very dangerous person and likely, if released into the community, to commit further acts of serious violence, including even murder against those who cross her, particularly males. A crime of the kind committed by the prisoner calls for the maximum penalty the law empowers the court to impose. He then sentenced her, stating, quote, "An examination of the cases referred to by counsel supports a view that I formed, namely that the only appropriate penalty for the prisoner is life imprisonment and that parole should never be considered for her. The prisoner should never be released. Catherine Mary Knight, you're pleaded guilty to and been convicted of the murder of John Charles Thomas Price at Aberdeen in the state of New South Wales on or about the 29th of February 2000. In respect to that crime, I sentence you to imprisonment for life." John Price's family erupted into applause. Knight simply smiled, turned, and went back to prison to spend the rest of her life behind bars, the first woman in Australia to receive such a sentence. In 2006, Knight appealed her sentence to the New South Wales Court of Appeal, saying that her punishment was too severe. Her appeal was rejected, with the judgment stating, quote, "This was an appalling crime, almost beyond contemplation in a civilized society." Catherine Knight is now 67 years old and remains housed at Silverwater Correctional Complex. She appears to have spent the last 21 years relatively quietly, and I cannot find any real record of what she's been up to. Regardless, she will remain behind bars for the rest of her natural life. I want to discover this case for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because I think it's a really interesting but truly horrifying case. Secondly, it's because, as someone pointed out, I've mainly focused on male on female domestic violence cases and wanted to cover a case where the roles are reversed. This is an extreme example of this, but it enables me to highlight similarities in the profiles of male and female domestic abuse perpetrators, but also key differences I've found. So, the similarities. Going back to the profile I've gone over several times, both male and female domestic abuse perpetrators seek to gain and maintain control over their intimate partners, often due to their emotional dependence on relationships, fear of abandonment, and low self-esteem. They think that, if given the choice, their partner will inevitably leave them, so they need to do everything they can to make sure this doesn't happen. The best way to do this is to take away their victim's choice by making them feel so low, so afraid, and making their life so empty that, even if it wanted to leave, they would feel unable to. If they show defiance in a relationship, i.e. thinking for themselves or acting without permission, they get punished, which reinforces the control the perpetrator has over them, but also shows them the consequence of defiance. Those with extreme issues with abandonment will often be fixated on their partner cheating on them and will constantly accuse them of infidelity, often without any evidence. This is a reflection of their fear of being abandoned. They'll confront their partner, accuse them of cheating, as I said, without any real evidence, putting their victim in an impossible situation. If they deny what the perpetrator has already decided they've done, they'll be punished. If they admit it, they'll be punished. A terrible situation to be in, I think you'll agree. So, that's the similarities. What are the differences? The differences are subtle, but important, and, in my experience, relate to hatred of certain genders. Let me explain. So often the most serious perpetrators of male on female domestic abusers have extremely negative views about women, sometimes pure hatred of this gender. This is often linked back to experiences with their mother, including being abandoned by them or not protected by them. For example, them being taken into care or not being protected from an abusive partner. The same is true of most dangerous female perpetrators of domestic abuse, but I've found that this hatred of men is far more pronounced and, to a great extent, understandably so. Unfortunately, it's the fact that female children are more likely to be the victim of horrific acts of abuse over a sustained period of time when they are growing up, most usually sexual abuse, and this is often by men they know
and should be able to trust, such as their father, siblings, or other family members. These experiences, which often go on for years and years and are usually unreported, understandably can lead them to have extremely negative views of men, seeing them as perverts, abusers, as well as this type of behaviour destroying their self-esteem, sense of self-worth, and identity. With both men and women who hold these negative views of the other gender, their behaviour is often far more extreme, often sadistic, and is not only used to gain and maintain control over their partner, but also, in their mind, to punish them for being male or female, taking out their hatred of their father, mother, etc. on this individual who happens to share the same gender. A good example of the level of violence a man who clearly hates women can display is Peter Tobin, who regularly raped his partners and, in one case, forced a knife into his partner's vagina, causing her such horrific injuries that she could not have children. He also decapitated a pet dog just to cause a girlfriend emotional pain. With Catherine Knight, her horrific upbringing inevitably led her to form a deep hatred of males because of what they did to her. This behaviour also destroyed her self-esteem and meant that she struggled to be alone, so she had to turn to men, who she hated, for comfort. When in the relationships, she sought to control them and punish them, and as each relationship broke down, her hatred increased. Men were evil, but she needed them. This is the horrific contradiction in the mind of the abuser. Due to the violence she experienced and saw in her childhood, this was ingrained in her as a way to solve issues and gain power over people. By the time she met John Price, she had several failed relationships under her belt, all because, in her mind, these men were dicks, and her anger and abandonment issues had got to the point where she was willing to kill and felt completely justified in doing so. You may think that it's just speculation that Knight had a hatred of men, or she made no qualms about telling people this, regularly telling her partners and anyone who would listen that, quote, all men are cunts. Unfortunately, Price tried to escape the relationship, to abandon Knight, like so many men had done before, and she couldn't have that. He needed to be punished, but, more than that, he needed to be utterly destroyed. So, she not only killed him, but butchered him, hanging his skin like some sort of trophy, treating him like cattle. Knight trying to feed Price to his own children, I think served two purposes. Firstly, it was to punish them, because she thought they were a barrier to her gaining complete control in the household. Secondly, I think she took great pleasure in imagining John Price being sickened by what she was trying to do to his children. I have some sympathy for Catherine Knight, as I do with anyone who's had an abusive background. However, we all have choices. An abusive childhood does not mean you have the right to abuse others. Catherine Knight made choices, and she's now having to live with the consequences of her decisions. I've included contact information for support services for women in previous videos, and I'm sure I'll return to this. But for this video, I want to focus on support services for men. However, across the board, regardless of your gender identity or your sexual preference, if you're going through this, I need you to hear me. This is not your fault. Some of the bravest and strongest people I've ever met have been those going through domestic abuse or have escaped it. An abuser will try to make you feel worthless, but this isn't true. Not at all. You are worth something. You're worth so much more than they've made you feel. With men specifically, I think unfortunately we often have a barrier in our head where, because we are male, we need to be seen as strong, and we convince ourselves that these things don't happen to men, but they do. And there are organisations and people who will not judge you and will help you. There are plenty of people like me out there who would stand by your side and support you every step of the way. So in the UK, a great service for men is the Men's Advice Line run by Respect. The email address and contact information will be in the description. You can contact them in various ways. You can speak to an advisor between 10 AM and 5 PM Monday to Friday on 0808 801 0327. You can also email them on info@mensadviceline, or one word, .org.uk, with a response being received sometime between Monday to Friday, 9 AM to 5 PM. Also, they have a web chat function, which is available through the website
on Wednesday between 10 a.m. and 11 a.m., and on a Thursday between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m. This service is for men who are victims of abuse, both from women as well as same-sex partners. In the US, please contact the National Domestic Abuse Hotline on 1-800-799-SAFE. I've checked.